I was visiting my grandpa's cabin deep in the woods. It was the kind of place that felt tucked away from the rest of the world, with towering pine trees lining the dirt road, and the only sounds were the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional creak of the old cabin settling. I loved it there. Grandpa had always made the place feel safe, even though it was surrounded by miles of dense forest. The air always felt different, crisp, pure, and heavy with the smell of pine and wet earth. It was the perfect escape from everything. That day started like any other. Grandpa and I spent the morning out by the woodshed, chopping wood. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows over the cabin. Grandpa wasn't much of a talker, but he had a way of sharing things without actually saying much. He'd point out certain birds or trees, telling me little things about them, as though I should have known them already. As the day wore on, I could feel the usual chill of evening creeping in. Grandpa always said when the sun started to go down, it was time to get inside and get cozy. He liked the evening's quiet, so we did. I helped him with the small tasks inside the cabin, like stoking the fire and setting up for dinner. We ate late that night, and after cleaning up, I decided to step outside for a bit. The cool air felt good after being inside for so long. I stood on the porch, leaning against the railing, looking out into the woods. The stars were starting to appear in the sky, and I could hear the distant sound of a creek trickling somewhere behind the cabin. I wasn't sure what made me turn my attention to the edge of the woods, but something caught my eye. First, I thought it was a deer. It was standing at the tree line, its silhouette just barely visible in the growing darkness. I knew there were deer around, so it wasn't unusual to see one at the edge of the woods, especially at dusk. But this one looked off. It was standing unnaturally still, almost frozen in place, and it seemed too large for a deer. The way it stood, its legs slightly bent, made me uneasy. It wasn't the shape I was used to seeing. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the longer I stared, the more the image seemed to distort. It wasn't just the size, it was the way it moved. The deer took a slow step forward, then another, its head turning just enough so that I could see the reflection of the light from the cabin in its eyes. The eyes were what unsettled me most. They weren't the usual dark, glossy eyes you see in deer. These were almost human-like, too bright, too knowing. I felt my stomach drop, and an uneasy chill ran down my spine. I stepped back from the railing, trying to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. I stayed there for a few moments, watching it, but my mind was racing. What was it doing? Why was it standing there so still? The longer I stared, the more my instincts told me something was terribly wrong. Then, without warning, the deer jerked its head up, its body stiffened, and in one quick movement, it bolted into the trees. The sound of its hooves pounding against the earth echoed through the forest, but something about its movements. They weren't the fluid, graceful run of a deer. It was jerky, disjointed, like something was forcing it to move. I don't know why, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I felt sick, as if something had just crossed the line between what should be normal and what definitely wasn't. I had the overwhelming urge to run inside the cabin, but something kept me standing there. I don't know if I was frozen by fear or if I was just trying to figure out if I had actually seen what I thought I saw. I turned back to the cabin, trying to brush it off. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe sick or injured. But as I stepped away from the railing and started to head inside, I glanced back one last time. That's when I saw it. The shape of the deer again, but this time it wasn't at the tree line. It was closer, too close. It was standing behind the thick trunks of the pine trees, almost blending in with the shadows, but I could still make out the shape. Its eyes were locked on me again. That's when I felt it. A cold, bone-deep fear. It wasn't like anything I had ever felt before. It wasn't the kind of fear you get when you hear an unexpected noise in the woods at night or when you think you're being watched. This was different. This was primal. The kind of fear that makes you want to run, but your legs won't move. I turned quickly, rushing to the door. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I swung open the cabin door, slamming it shut behind me. Grandpa was sitting at the kitchen table, reading a book by the dim light of a lantern. He looked up when I came in, but I didn't say anything right away. I just stood there, breathing heavily, my mind racing with what I had just seen. "Grandpa," I finally said, my voice shaking. He set the book down and looked at me carefully. "What's wrong?" I took a deep breath. "There's something outside." He didn't ask me what it was. Instead, he stood up immediately. His face went from relaxed to tense, and I could see the way his hands moved like he knew exactly what to do. Without a word, he grabbed his jacket and his flashlight, and he motioned for me to follow him. I didn't hesitate, even though every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay inside, to hide. But I knew better than to argue with Grandpa when he looked like that. We walked quietly outside, Grandpa's flashlight sweeping across the ground. I kept close to him, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The forest felt different now. It was like everything had gone still. No rustling in the leaves, no chirping from the birds, just silence. We made our way toward the tree line where I had seen the deer. Grandpa didn't say anything. He just moved calmly, methodically, like he had done this 100 times before. I felt like I was walking in slow motion, my heart pounding in my throat. When we reached the spot, Grandpa stopped. His flashlight illuminated the ground, and for a moment, I thought I might be seeing things. But then I saw it too, tracks. Not deer tracks. These were different. They were deeper, wider, and they didn't match anything I had seen before. They looked wrong. "Grandpa!" My voice was barely a whisper. "What is that?" Grandpa didn't answer me. He crouched down, inspecting the prints carefully. His face had gone hard, his expression unreadable. He straightened up after a moment and turned back toward the cabin. "We need to go inside. Now." I didn't argue. I followed him back to the cabin, feeling like something was just wrong with the world. Something that couldn't be explained. Something that I couldn't unsee. As we reached the door, Grandpa paused, looking out into the woods one last time. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was thinking. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. We went inside, and Grandpa locked the door behind us. He didn't speak much after that. He just sat down at the table again, looking at the fire, his face unreadable. I didn't ask him what he thought we'd just seen. I didn't need to. I already knew. I had seen enough to understand. I went to bed that night with my mind racing. I couldn't shake the image of those eyes, the way they had watched me from the trees so knowingly. It was like it wasn't even a deer. It was something else, something wearing the skin of a deer. The next morning, Grandpa said we were leaving. He didn't explain why, but he didn't need to. We packed up quickly, and by the time the sun was fully up, we were on the road, leaving the cabin behind. I didn't ask any questions. I didn't need to. We never spoke of it again. It was the kind of place you only visit when you're looking for isolation. A small cabin tucked away in the woods, far from the hum of any city or even the nearest neighbor. My friend Brad had rented it out for the weekend. I wasn't entirely sure why he had chosen such a remote location, but he said it would be a great way to disconnect, and honestly, I was looking forward to a break from everything too. We drove for hours, past endless stretches of trees, winding roads, and barely any signs of civilization. The cabin, when we finally saw it, was exactly what you'd expect. Simple, rustic, and surrounded by towering pines that seemed to swallow up the sunlight. The air smelled of wood, damp earth, and pine sap. The only sounds were the occasional calls of distant birds and the wind rustling through the branches. It was quiet, too quiet. The first evening was peaceful. We unpacked our things and settled in. The cabin had an old stone fireplace, a few creaky wooden chairs, and a small kitchen with just enough for us to cook a meal. There was a porch out front, where we set up a couple of folding chairs, cracked open some beers, and talked as the sun set. The shadows stretched long across the woods, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But I chalked it up to the isolation and my overactive imagination. That night, after a simple dinner of pasta and wine, we both retired to our respective rooms. The cabin wasn't big, but it was enough for the two of us. I lay there in the stillness, trying to get comfortable under the thin covers, but sleep didn't come easily. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap outside or a rustle in the trees. It wasn't unusual. Animals were all over the place. The woods were alive with them, yet the sounds felt too close, too deliberate. It wasn't until I heard the low growl that I sat up, heart pounding in my chest. It was a deep, rumbling sound, like something large and heavy was moving through the woods. I listened closely, but the sound didn't come again. Maybe a bear, I thought, or some other animal. I'd heard that wolves had been spotted in the area, though I hadn't expected one this close to the cabin. It wasn't until I heard it again, closer this time, that I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't like any animal I had ever heard. It was a growl, sure, but it had something else to it. An intelligence behind it, something almost human. I threw the covers off and slipped out of bed, my feet landing softly on the cold wooden floor. I went to the window, careful not to make any noise, and peeked through the blinds. The moon was high, casting silver beams across the land. The woods beyond the cabin were dark, but I could just make out the shapes of trees and the faint movement of shadows. I didn't see anything at first, just the wind moving the branches, but then I noticed something odd. There was a shape out there, something crouched low to the ground, barely visible in the dim light. It was big, too big for any normal animal, and yet it didn't move like one. It was on all fours, but its back seemed too straight, too unnatural. I watched, transfixed, as the creature sniffed the air, its head turning slowly in every direction, as if searching for something. It had the body of a large dog, but there was something deeply wrong about it. Its eyes gleamed in the dark, bright and cold, reflecting the light from the cabin. Then it disappeared into the woods, moving too quickly for any animal I'd ever known. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I thought about waking Brad, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I convinced myself I had imagined it, that it was just a trick of the moonlight or maybe an animal passing through. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, Brad seemed in high spirits, as if the night had been a peaceful one. I didn't mention what I'd seen. He was the kind of guy who would laugh it off and tell me I was overthinking things. Instead, I kept the unease to myself, though I couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes from my mind. We spent the day hiking the nearby trails, exploring the woods. The trees were massive, their trunks thick and gnarled. The forest seemed almost impenetrable in places, with dense undergrowth and tangled roots making navigation difficult. We didn't see much wildlife, just the occasional bird or squirrel darting across the path. But every so often, I'd catch the faintest sound behind us. Something moving, but not quite right. I would turn, expecting to see a deer or a bear, but there was nothing. That night, the atmosphere seemed heavier. The air was thick, and the forest felt different, almost oppressive. We stayed inside after dinner, the fire crackling and popping in the fireplace. Brad was reading a book, and I was half watching a movie on my phone, but my attention kept drifting to the window. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, the growling returned. It was closer this time, so close that I could feel it vibrating in my chest. I jumped up, my heart racing. Brad looked up from his book, confused. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I hear it again," I said, voice tight. "That growl." Brad stood and walked to the window. He peered out into the dark. "It's probably just a bear or something. Relax." I didn't feel relaxed. Not at all. My mind was spinning, but I forced myself to stay calm. It wasn't a bear. I was sure of it. The growl didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. It was like a deep, guttural sound, coming from something much larger than a bear. We sat in silence for a while, the sound growing louder, closer. It moved around the cabin, circling it. I couldn't make out what it was, but I knew it wasn't just a wild animal. There was something wrong about it. It was deliberate, too calculated, like it was trying to get us to notice it. Brad finally broke the silence. "We need to check this out." I felt my stomach drop. The last thing I wanted to do was go outside and confront whatever that thing was. but Brad was already grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. "Stay here," I said. "I'll go." "No way. We're in this together," Brad replied. I didn't argue. We stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The moonlight barely pierced the thick canopy above us. The growl was closer now, coming from the trees to the side of the cabin. It sounded like it was circling us, testing us. We crept toward the edge of the porch, trying to move quietly, but the sound of the gravel beneath our boots felt too loud. I stopped, holding up my hand. I could hear something breathing slow, steady, heavy. It wasn't an animal's breath. It was too slow, too deliberate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I tried to make sense of the noise. Brad's breath was shallow, his voice barely a whisper. "What the hell is that?" Then we saw it. The creature was standing just beyond the trees, its massive form hidden mostly in the shadows. It was much larger than I'd first thought, easily the size of a large bear, but its posture was wrong. It wasn't a bear or a wolf or anything I could recognize. Its body was hunched, covered in patchy, matted fur. Its limbs were longer than they should have been, ending in twisted claws that scraped the ground. And its face, it was the face that haunted me. The eyes gleamed like burning coals, reflecting the dim light from the cabin. It wasn't just a creature, it was something else, something that shouldn't exist. I froze, not daring to move. Brad pulled me back, and we quickly retreated into the cabin. We locked the door, and I couldn't even bring myself to look out the window. I knew it was still out there, watching, waiting. We didn't sleep that night. We didn't talk either. The weight of what we'd seen hung between us, an unspoken truth that neither of us wanted to face. But we both knew we weren't staying another night. We packed up in the morning, driving out of the woods with nothing but the sound of our tires on the gravel road to keep us company. We didn't look back. That night, as we reached the safety of the nearest town, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been following us. That creature had known we were there long before we'd seen it. It was waiting, and it wasn't done yet. The cabin was small, tucked away on a secluded piece of land. No neighbors for miles, just trees, rocks, and the occasional deer or squirrel. I had rented it out for a long weekend to get away from everything. The noise, the crowds, the distractions. Just me and the woods. It was perfect for that. The cabin itself was old, probably built decades ago. The wood was weathered, but sturdy. The floors creaked with every step, and the furniture was basic but functional. The smell of pine and old wood filled the air. Outside, the wind whistled through the trees, but there was a certain peace to it. The kind of peace you get when you're so far away from the chaos of city life. I didn't plan on doing much. A few books, some hiking, maybe a little fishing by the nearby creek. It wasn't until the second evening that things started to feel off. I had just returned from a hike, feeling the burn in my legs from the steep incline, and made my way to the cabin to relax. The sun had started to set, casting long shadows over the land. I was used to the quiet, but there was something in the air that night. It felt heavier, as if the woods were holding its breath. I went inside, made myself a sandwich, and sat at the small wooden table near the window. The sky was slowly turning dark, and I could see the last of the daylight fading behind the trees. That's when I noticed it. At first, it was just a shape, something moving between the trees. I couldn't make it out clearly, but it was large. Too large to be a deer or a bear. It was crouched low, almost like it was sneaking through the woods. My first thought was that it might be some sort of animal, maybe a mountain lion. But the movement was too strange, too deliberate. I leaned closer to the window, my heart starting to race. I knew I shouldn't be out here alone at night. Not that far out in the woods, especially with something that big moving around. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my boots crunching the dry leaves beneath me. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe some wildlife. But my gut told me something was wrong. I crept toward the tree line, the flashlight beam bouncing off the trunks and branches. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I felt exposed, like I was being watched. And then I saw it again, that shape. But this time it was clearer. It wasn't an animal. Not in any way I understood. It looked almost human, but it wasn't. Its body was hunched, with long, gangly limbs that seemed too long for its torso. Its skin was a pale, sickly gray, stretched tight over its bones. And its head was far too large for its body. The eyes were wide and black, too large for its face, like they were bulging out of its skull. There were no other features, just those black, empty eyes staring right at me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a long moment, neither of us moved. It was like we were in some sort of standoff. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, louder than anything else. My flashlight flickered, and I quickly shook it, trying to keep it steady, but my hands were trembling. The creature didn't move at first, just staring at me. I didn't know whether to scream or run. My legs felt like they were made of lead. But then, slowly, it began to move. It wasn't the way an animal would move, more like the way something was trying to force its body into unnatural positions. It crawled forward, its long arms reaching out in a way that looked painful, like it was struggling to move in its own skin. The crack of a twig beneath its weight echoed in the stillness, and I knew it was getting closer. I didn't wait to see how close it would get. I turned and ran. My heart was pounding in my chest as I rushed back to the cabin. The wind seemed to pick up, howling through the trees like a warning, but all I could think about was getting inside. I slammed the door behind me, bolting it shut, and slid down the wood against the wall, breathing hard. I could hear my pulse in my ears, the blood rushing through my head. I didn't know what it was or where it came from, but I knew it wasn't something I should be out there with. The cabin was silent, save for my heavy breathing. I sat there in the dark, staring at the door, wondering if I had imagined it. Maybe I had. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, making me see things in the dark. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't. I tried to push the thought out of my mind. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 9:15 p.m. The battery was low, but I wasn't about to go outside to try and get a better signal. I thought about calling someone, but I didn't want to sound crazy. No one would believe me, and what good would it do to call the police? There was no telling what was out there, and they wouldn't have any idea either. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I was overreacting, that I had just seen some strange animal, and my imagination had filled in the rest. But when I looked out the window again, I saw it. It was standing near the edge of the clearing, not far from the cabin, just standing there, looking at me. I backed away from the window, my breath caught in my throat again. I wasn't sure what to do. If I stayed inside, I felt like I was trapping myself. If I went out there, I'd be running straight toward whatever it was. My mind raced, trying to find a solution that wouldn't end in disaster. I knew I couldn't stay inside forever. Eventually, I'd have to leave, but I didn't know how. I tried to think of an escape plan, but the more I thought, the less sure I was of anything. I could feel the tension building inside me, the weight of the silence, and the sense that I was being hunted. I needed a way out, but there was no way out, not without facing that thing. Hours passed, and the creature never left. It never moved. It just stood there, still as a stone, staring at me. I couldn't bring myself to fall asleep. The darkness felt too heavy, and I couldn't escape the feeling that it was watching, waiting. Finally, around 3 a.m., exhaustion started to creep in. My eyelids grew heavy, and I tried to shake it off, but the fatigue was too much. I lay down on the couch, trying to keep my eyes open. I had to stay alert. It wasn't until just before dawn that I finally heard it. A tapping sound, faint but persistent, like nails tapping against wood. I shot up, wide awake, staring at the door. The creature was no longer standing outside. It was at the door. I felt the blood drain from my face. It was trying to get in. The tapping turned into a slow scratching, like it was trying to pry the door open with its fingers. I could hear it moving, pressing against the wood. I knew it wouldn't stop until it got inside. I scrambled to my feet, looking around the cabin for something, anything, to defend myself with. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a heavy chair. I dragged it to the door and wedged it against the knob. The scratching continued, but I wasn't sure how much longer it would hold. My heart raced. I couldn't just sit there and wait for it to break in. With no other choice, I made a run for it. I bolted out the back door, feeling the cold night air hit me like a slap to the face. I didn't look back, didn't think about what might be behind me. I just ran through the trees toward the road that led back to civilization. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station, nearly 10 miles away. I was covered in sweat, my legs burning, but I didn't care. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't even want to go back to the woods. I don't know what it was. I don't know where it came from or why it was there. I don't know if it was a mistake to rent that cabin, or if I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. All I know is that I will never be alone in the woods again. I was running out of options. My luck had run dry, and I was back at square one. I had always been the kind of person who could scrape by, make ends meet, but everything had spiraled out of control in the last year. Losing my job was the breaking point. No savings, no support system, and no direction. At first, I stayed in shelters, but the constant noise, the lack of privacy, the desperate faces around me, none of it felt safe anymore. I needed a place to be alone, to think, even if only for a little while. That's when I found the cabin. It wasn't much, old and run down, tucked away in the woods far enough from the nearest town to make it feel like an escape. It wasn't far enough to be isolated beyond help, but far enough to feel like I could finally breathe. The cabin was abandoned. No one had lived there for years, but it was sturdy enough to keep the rain off and the wind out. The roof wasn't leaking, the walls weren't caving in, and the door had a solid lock. It wasn't a mansion, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a place to rest. I didn't have much with me, just a backpack with a few belongings and a jacket I found at a thrift store. I went to the cabin as soon as I could, feeling the cold bite of the wind on my face as I hiked through the woods. The sun had just started to dip below the horizon, and I was grateful I had made it before nightfall. I could already see the outline of the cabin through the trees. It was a small, simple structure with a slanted roof and wide windows. The kind of place you might expect a family to have built decades ago, but now abandoned. I stepped onto the porch, a layer of old leaves and dirt scattered around the floor. The place didn't feel welcoming, but it didn't feel threatening either. Just neutral. I pushed open the door with a creak, stepping into the dimly lit interior. The floor was made of rough wooden planks, and there was a stone fireplace at one end of the room. It looked like it had been a cozy spot once, with old armchairs and a worn-out rug, but it had been a long time since anyone had bothered to care for the place. I took a moment to gather myself before setting my bag down by the door. There was a small table with a few chairs, and the kitchen area, though sparse, had the basics. A sink, a rusty stove, and a few cabinets. I was already starting to feel the weight of isolation settle over me, but it wasn't a bad feeling, at least not at first. I had been around people for too long. I didn't mind the silence. The first night passed uneventfully. I made a small fire, ate what little food I had, and tried to get some rest. The bed wasn't great, just an old mattress on a wooden frame, but it was better than the cold, hard ground. The night felt long and still. Every now and then, I thought I heard the wind howling outside or a branch scraping against the window, but I convinced myself it was nothing. I pulled the blanket tight around me and closed my eyes. The next morning was quiet, too. I spent most of the day outside, exploring the small area around the cabin. There was a creek not far off, the water running clear and cold over the rocks. The woods around me were thick, but I could see a few trails that looked like they were used by animals. It was a peaceful spot, but something gnawed at me. Maybe it was just my nerves, but it felt like I wasn't quite alone. It wasn't anything specific, just an unease I couldn't shake. I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. That's when the thought crossed my mind. Who had been here before? The cabin didn't look entirely forgotten. There were signs of someone having lived here recently. A small pile of firewood stacked neatly by the door, a rusted shovel leaning against the wall outside. Maybe someone else had been squatting here, or maybe it was just the place's remnants, left over from the past. but it was enough to make me wonder. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon again, I heard something that set my nerves on edge. It was a low sound, almost like a distant groan or a thump. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then it came again, louder this time. A slow, heavy thud that seemed to echo through the walls. I got up to investigate, my heart racing a little faster. I grabbed the flashlight I had in my bag, shining it out through the window, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. I opened the door cautiously, scanning the area around the cabin, but there was no sign of movement. The trees stood still, the wind barely rustling the leaves. Still, the unease was there, like someone or something was watching me. I shut the door and locked it, sitting in the dim light, listening for any more sounds. The night stretched on in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. A tense, expectant kind of quiet. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my nerves playing tricks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next few days followed the same pattern. I woke early, went outside, explored a little, and then returned to the cabin in the evening. The unease didn't leave, but I started to convince myself it was just my isolation getting to me. I tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on the things I could control, keeping the fire going, making sure I had enough food, staying warm. But it was hard to ignore the feeling of being watched. One afternoon, I noticed something odd. The door to the cabin had been moved. It wasn't much, just a small shift, but it was enough to make me pause. It wasn't like that when I left in the morning. Someone had been here. My heart started to race. I stepped back slowly, scanning the trees around me, but there was nothing, no signs of movement. I knew I hadn't been imagining the thuds from earlier. Someone or something was out there. I grabbed a knife from my bag, the cold metal reassuring in my grip. I checked the windows again, but still saw nothing. The silence around me was deafening. I didn't dare go outside yet. I needed to think. Hours passed, and the sun began to set again. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being stalked. But who was out there? What did they want? I spent the rest of the evening huddled in the corner of the cabin, watching the door, waiting for the inevitable sound of footsteps or the soft creak of a floorboard. It came when the moon was high, and the cabin was bathed in pale light. I was half dozing, my eyes fluttering closed, when I heard it. A faint scratching at the door, like nails dragging over wood. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. The scratching stopped, and I could hear a low, slow breath, like someone was standing just on the other side, listening. I held my breath, the knife tight in my hand. Time seemed to stretch, every second feeling like an eternity. Then, without warning, the door slammed open, the force so sudden that it rattled the walls. I lunged forward, the knife raised, but there was nothing there. The door had swung wide open, revealing only the empty woods. I ran to close it, my mind racing, my thoughts chaotic. Was it a person? A wild animal? I locked the door again, heart racing, but I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin much longer. I needed to leave. The thought of running, of getting away, consumed me. The next morning, I packed up quickly. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to stay calm, to move deliberately. The weight of the knife in my bag gave me some comfort as I left the cabin behind. As I walked through the woods, I couldn't help but glance back. The cabin was just a dark shape now, disappearing among the trees. When I reached the town, I didn't look back. The unease still clung to me, like a shadow I couldn't shake, but I was free. I had escaped. I didn't know what was out there in those woods, whether it was people or something else, but I was done with that cabin. I didn't care to know. The woods had won this time, and that was enough for me. It was one of those weekends where I felt the need to disconnect from everything. The constant noise, the rush of daily life, the endless digital buzz. Sometimes it all gets too much. So, I decided to take a break and go to my cabin. It was small, tucked away in a little corner of the woods where the trees swallowed up the world and the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no distractions. It was the kind of place where you could really be alone with your thoughts, or so I thought. The drive up was peaceful. I remember the winding roads, the fading sunlight filtering through the trees, the almost deafening silence that only deep woods can create. It was a solitude I welcomed, or at least I thought I did. My cabin had been in the family for years, tucked away like a secret. It was far enough from civilization that you could hear the wind in the trees and the occasional rustling of wildlife, but not so far that it was completely isolated. People knew about it, but it wasn't the kind of place that drew crowds. It was just the right mix of out of the way and accessible. I got there just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The golden hour painted the sky in rich oranges and purples, and I could feel the familiar calm settling in as I unloaded my things. The cabin was small, a single story with a front porch that creaked when you walked on it. There was a small wood stove inside for heat, a kitchen with just enough space for a few essentials, and a couple of bedrooms. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I spent the next hour unpacking, setting up my space, and making sure everything was in order. The place had been empty for a while, and I wanted to make sure there was no damage. After a quick check, I set up my dinner, just something simple, some canned soup, and a few crackers. I planned to take it easy that night, read, maybe do some writing. I'd forgotten how peaceful the quiet could be. As the evening darkened and the last of the sunlight slipped away, I settled into the couch with my book. The fire crackled in the stove, sending warm flickers of light dancing on the walls. Outside, the night noises began. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of branches in the breeze, the occasional snap of a twig under the weight of something moving in the woods. It was all perfectly normal, but there was something about the stillness that felt off, like it was too quiet at the same time. My eyes kept drifting to the window, half expecting to see something move just outside the reach of the porch light, but nothing ever did. I shook off the unease, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I hadn't been here in a while after all. I finished my dinner and cleaned up, setting everything back in place. The cabin, small as it was, felt larger in the dark, especially when you were alone. There was a silence that surrounded the place, a thick, almost oppressive quiet that seemed to press in from all sides. The wind had picked up, and I could hear the branches creaking in the trees, their groans echoing through the night. It was enough to make me second-guess the decision to stay. Around 10:30, I decided to call it a night. I didn't have any plans for the next day, so there was no rush to be up early. I turned off the lights and went to bed, pulling the thick blanket over myself. The bed was small but comfortable, the kind that made you sink in just enough to feel cozy. It was the kind of night where everything seemed still, the kind where sleep should have come easily. But it didn't. First, it was just a slight disturbance. I thought I heard something outside, but when I strained to listen, the sound disappeared. The wind? A branch falling? Couldn't be sure, but it kept me from falling asleep. My mind wandered, each creak of the cabin settling, making me more alert, more aware of the silence. My eyes flicked to the window, where the dark shadows of the trees pressed against the glass. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I was imagining things, but there was something about the night that didn't sit right with me. Then I heard it again, a rustling. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon, but it was closer this time, just beyond the cabin, and it wasn't the typical sounds I'd expect from wildlife. It was too deliberate, too heavy. Something was out there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the sound grew louder, moving along the side of the cabin. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. I forced myself to stay still. Maybe it was a bear. Bears were common in these woods, though they usually stayed farther off. I'd had encounters before, but never so close to the cabin. The sound stopped just outside the window. I could feel the presence of whatever it was, even though I couldn't see it. The silence that followed was suffocating. My thoughts raced. Should I get up and look? Should I just stay quiet, wait for it to leave? The cabin felt smaller, suffocating in the dark. I couldn't tell if the thing was still there or if it had moved on. My mind raced, my body frozen in place. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. My body screamed at me to move, to check, to see what was out there, but I stayed motionless. listening. Finally, the silence was broken by the faintest sound, the unmistakable crunch of something heavy walking on the gravel outside the door. Then a tap, a sharp, quick tap against the wood. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. I waited, and waited, and waited. There was nothing now. No movement, no rustling, just the sound of my own breathing, ragged and shallow in the stillness of the cabin. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I got the courage to get up. I crept quietly to the window, trying to peer through the darkness outside. The porch light barely illuminated the area in front of the cabin, casting long shadows that made everything seem distorted. The gravel path was empty. There was no sign of anything or anyone being out there. I felt a mixture of relief and dread. Maybe it was just an animal, a large one, that had wandered too close. Maybe it wasn't anything at all. But as I stood there, staring into the night, the feeling that something wasn't right didn't go away. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound made me jump. Every creak of the cabin made me think something was moving outside. The next morning, I woke up with a tightness in my chest, the remnants of a restless night weighing on me. The sun was up, and the woods outside looked peaceful again, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I went outside to check the area around the cabin, looking for any signs of disturbance. The gravel was undisturbed, no footprints, no sign that anything had been there. The woods were as they always were, calm, still, nothing out of the ordinary. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching. The day passed without incident. I took a long walk through the woods, trying to clear my head. The cool air helped calm my nerves, and by the evening, I was starting to feel more at ease. I cooked dinner, sat by the fire, and slowly began to push the strange events from the night before to the back of my mind. It was just my imagination, I told myself. It had to be. That night, I went to bed early, determined to get some good sleep. The quiet of the cabin wrapped around me again, and this time I welcomed it. As I drifted off, the last thought in my mind was how good it felt to be away from everything, to have some peace. But that peace didn't last long. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the same feeling of dread from the night before. The silence was too deep, too oppressive. I could hear it again, the faint rustling outside, moving slowly along the edge of the cabin. This time it was heavier, more deliberate. The tapping sound came again, sharper, louder, as though someone or something was trying to get my attention. My heart began to pound, and I could feel the blood rush to my head as panic set in. I couldn't just lie there again. I had to know what was out there. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and crept toward the window, my breath shallow, my mind racing. The light flickered on, and I aimed it at the front porch. For a moment, there was nothing, but then I saw it. A figure standing just outside the beam of the light, too tall, too still to be natural. I froze, the light shaking in my hand. The figure stepped closer, and in that moment, I realized it wasn't human. It was too large, too unnatural in its movements. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished into the trees. I didn't wait to see more. I grabbed my things, got in the car, and left. I haven't been back since. It was one of those weekends where I just needed to get away from everything. I had been cooped up in the city for too long, and the stress was starting to weigh on me. So, when my cousin mentioned a cabin he had rented up in the mountains, I didn't hesitate. It sounded perfect, remote, peaceful, far from the buzz of daily life. He assured me it was an old, secluded cabin, but with a rustic charm. I wasn't expecting luxury, but I thought it'd be a good change of pace. The drive up was long. The further we went, the fewer signs of civilization there were. I could feel the tension in the air, the way the trees grew denser, their branches reaching toward each other like they were trying to keep something out. I wasn't sure if it was the isolation or the silence, but it felt like the world outside had been left behind. By the time we arrived, it was late afternoon. The cabin was exactly what I had imagined, but older. The paint on the walls was chipped, the roof a little crooked, and the windows were darkened by dirt and age. There were no other buildings around, just the dense forest surrounding it on all sides. We unloaded the car and headed inside. The inside of the cabin smelled musty, like old wood and damp earth. It was dark too, even though the sun was still up. The light that filtered through the dirty windows barely made it past the thick curtains. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a couple of worn-out couches. Everything felt a little off, like the place hadn't been properly cared for in years. The wood floors creaked under our feet, and the walls seemed to groan in the quiet. It wasn't cozy or charming. It felt forgotten. I tried to shake off the unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. I wanted to enjoy the weekend, so I ignored the nagging feeling that kept growing the longer I stayed inside. I decided to take a walk around the property to clear my head. I needed to get away from the cabin for a bit, to remind myself why I came in the first place. The air outside was thick with the scent of pine and earth. The trees stretched high above, their leaves barely moving in the stillness. The ground beneath my feet was soft with a layer of pine needles, and I could hear the occasional snap of a twig as I moved. I walked for a while, taking in the silence, until I noticed a strange detail. There was a small, overgrown path leading deeper into the woods, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. Curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to follow it. The path twisted through the trees, narrowing as I went, the dense underbrush making it harder to move. It felt like the woods were closing in around me, the trees seeming to press in from all sides. I walked for what seemed like hours, but the more I walked, the more the path seemed to lead nowhere. The sunlight had faded, and the shadows grew longer, stretching across the forest floor. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking behind me, but the path was empty. I finally turned around, realizing that I had strayed too far. The feeling of unease was stronger now, like I was being watched. I quickened my pace, trying to find my way back to the cabin. But the more I walked, the more I felt disoriented. The woods seemed endless, and the path I had followed was no longer visible. Panic started to set in. I had no idea where I was. My phone had no signal, and the only sound was the rustling of the leaves in the breeze. That's when I saw it. A faint light flickered through the trees ahead of me. It wasn't like a campfire or a flashlight. It was more of a glow, soft and almost inviting, but there was something wrong about it. The light wasn't natural. I should have turned around then, but instead, I kept walking toward it, drawn in by something I couldn't explain. As I got closer, the glow became brighter, and I saw it. Another cabin, hidden deep in the woods, almost identical to the one I was staying in, but older, even more decayed. The wood was rotting, the roof caved in several places, and the windows were shattered. It looked abandoned, but somehow alive. There was something about it that made my skin crawl. I stopped just at the edge of the clearing, the cabin in front of me seeming to stare back, its broken windows like empty eyes. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I took a step closer, but something made me pause. The air had grown colder, the silence deeper. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, suffocating, like the world was holding its breath. I took another step, but then I heard something behind me, faint rustling, a crack of a branch. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, expecting to see someone or something standing behind me, but there was nothing. The woods were still. I waited, straining my ears, but there was nothing more. I turned back toward the cabin. The light had faded slightly, and now it almost seemed to flicker like a dying flame. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar, swaying in the wind. Without thinking, I moved toward it. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air inside was thick with dust and mildew. The floors were covered in a layer of dirt, and the walls were crumbling. But what struck me the most was the smell. It was rancid, like something had died inside and was left to rot. I covered my nose, trying not to gag, but the smell seemed to cling to everything, seeping into my clothes and my skin. I walked deeper into the cabin, drawn by a strange compulsion. The light from the setting sun barely illuminated the space, casting long, dark shadows across the room. I moved through the space slowly, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. There were remnants of furniture scattered around. A broken chair here, an overturned table there. But what caught my eye was something on the far wall, near the back door. It was a painting, old and faded, of a landscape, mountains, trees, and a cabin, just like the one I was in. But the longer I looked at it, the more I realized something wasn't right. The cabin in the painting looked exactly like the one I had seen earlier, the one that seemed so familiar, so out of place. And in the corner of the painting, barely visible, was a figure, a shadow with long, outstretched arms. I stepped closer to the painting, my heart pounding. I reached out to touch it, but as my fingers brushed the surface, I heard it again. A sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, heavy, slow, deliberate. I froze. The footsteps were coming from behind me. I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. Panic surged through me. I had to get out of there. I turned toward the door, but it slammed shut with a loud bang, shaking the cabin. I jumped back, my heart racing, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The walls creaked and groaned as if the cabin itself was alive, shifting, moving, closing in on me. I grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck. My mind raced. I needed to escape. I glanced around the cabin, looking for another way out. The window near the back was open just a crack. It was a long shot, but it was my only chance. I ran for it, my hands shaking as I reached the window. I pulled with all my strength, and after a moment of resistance, the window gave way. I climbed through, falling into the dirt outside. I didn't stop running until I reached the path again, the trees behind me feeling like they were closing in on me. I didn't look back. I just kept running, my breath ragged, my mind a blur of fear and confusion. When I finally made it back to the cabin I was staying in, the sun had set completely, and the place felt even more isolated than before. I didn't tell my cousin what had happened. I didn't need to. I just locked myself inside, checked the doors and windows, and stayed up the entire night, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. The next morning, when I left, I took one last look at the cabin behind me. It was just a cabin, a decaying relic of the past, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me the entire time. I didn't go back to that part of the woods again, and I don't think I ever will. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. My friend and I had been planning this trip for weeks. A little getaway to a cabin in the woods. Just a small, secluded place, miles away from any town, where we could unwind, fish, hike, and get away from the distractions of everyday life. The cabin was old, weathered, but comfortable. It had all the basics: electricity, a fireplace, a small kitchen. Nothing fancy, but it would do. I was looking forward to the quiet and peace. We drove out there early Friday morning, the road winding through dense forests and over narrow bridges. The air smelled fresh and earthy, like pine trees and damp soil. After a few hours, we finally made it. The cabin stood alone on a hill, surrounded by towering trees. A small porch overlooked a clearing where a stream ran, babbling gently. There was something peaceful about it, the kind of place where you could just sit back and forget the world for a while. The first day was uneventful. We unpacked, made a fire, and sat outside, drinking beers, enjoying the quiet. The sun dipped below the horizon, and we started preparing dinner, the smell of grilled food filling the air. The only sounds were the occasional crackle from the fire and the distant calls of birds. It felt like we were the only people left in the world. That night, after dinner, we sat on the porch, the darkness enveloping us, listening to the wind in the trees. The night was peaceful, but there was an underlying tension in the air, like something wasn't quite right, though I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't until the second night that things took a turn. We had gone to bed around midnight. The cabin was dark, save for the soft glow from the fireplace. The bed creaked slightly as I turned over, trying to get comfortable. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees, making strange noises against the walls. I didn't think much of it, just the usual sounds you hear in a cabin in the woods. But then I heard something different, a faint scratching at the window. At first, I figured it was just a branch or something from the wind, but the scratching grew louder, more deliberate. It sounded like claws. It wasn't just tapping against the glass. It was a slow, deliberate dragging, like something was trying to get inside. My heart began to race. I got up quietly, careful not to wake my friend, and went to the window. I peered out into the darkness. The porch light barely illuminated the clearing below. For a moment, I saw nothing but trees and the sway of branches in the wind. But then I noticed something moving just outside the reach of the light. It was a shape, something big, moving slowly toward the cabin. My stomach churned. I stepped back from the window, my mind racing. I couldn't make out what it was. It looked like some kind of animal, but it wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen before. It was too tall, too broad. And then it moved again. The shape shifted, and I could see more clearly now. It was standing on two legs. My heart skipped a beat. The thing had the build of a man, but its limbs were twisted, its body covered in fur. I couldn't see its face, but I could tell its head was too large, its posture hunched in a way that was unnatural. I froze. My mind screamed for me to move, to do something, but I couldn't. It just stood there watching the cabin. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. And then it turned and lumbered off into the trees, its steps heavy and deliberate. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring at the empty clearing, trying to make sense of what I had seen. It didn't make sense, couldn't have been real, but the fear gnawed at my insides, and I knew I had seen something that wasn't supposed to be there. I slowly turned back to my bed, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. I lay there for hours, unable to sleep, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. The wind howled through the trees, and every rustle of leaves seemed like footsteps. The next morning, I didn't mention anything to my friend. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe a bear or some other animal I'd misidentified in the dark. But deep down, I knew what I had seen, and the thought of it, standing just outside the window watching me, made my skin crawl. The day passed slowly. We went hiking through the woods, trying to keep our minds off the previous night. But the forest felt different now. It wasn't the same peaceful place I had arrived at. There was something else in the trees, something watching us. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf, made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something moving in the shadows. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew thick, heavy with an oppressive stillness. We made dinner, and the wind picked up again, stronger than before, rattling the windows and making the trees creak. But I wasn't paying attention to the wind. I was paying attention to the sounds in the woods. After dinner, we sat out on the porch again, the quiet almost unbearable. I kept glancing into the trees, certain I was being watched. It was around 10 p.m. when I heard it, a low, guttural growl, so deep it vibrated the ground beneath me. My heart stopped. I turned to my friend. "Did you hear that?" She looked up, frowning. "Yeah, it sounded like an animal, but that was way too low. I didn't need to hear anything more." The growl came again, this time louder, closer. My friend stood up, looking toward the edge of the clearing where the trees met the open space. I followed her gaze, my stomach tightening, and then I saw it. There, just outside the tree line, a figure was standing. It was too far to make out clearly, but I could see its outline, tall and wide, its shape more man than beast. My breath caught in my throat. The growl came again, louder this time, and I saw it move. Its movements were slow but deliberate, as if it knew we were watching. It was circling us, pacing just outside the edge of the clearing. My friend didn't say anything. She just stared at it, her face pale. Then it happened. The figure moved quickly, darting behind a tree and disappearing from sight. I stood up, every muscle in my body tense. I felt like a rabbit caught in the gaze of a predator. We sat in silence, not daring to move, listening to the sounds of the forest. The growl was gone now, but the air was thick with tension. For what felt like hours, we waited. The only sound was the wind, whipping through the trees, but there was no more growling, no more movement. Slowly, cautiously, I stood up and made my way inside the cabin. My friend followed me, and we locked the door behind us. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We both knew what had happened, and we both knew that whatever it was still out there, waiting. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I don't remember when I finally fell asleep, but I woke up early the next morning with a feeling of dread hanging over me. I knew we had to leave. I didn't care if it was only our second day there. I didn't care if we had planned this trip for weeks. We were getting out. I didn't care if I was overreacting. Whatever that thing was out there, I didn't want to find out. We packed up quickly. No words exchanged, just the hurried rustling of bags and the sound of things being thrown into the car. I couldn't get the doors closed fast enough. I couldn't get away from that cabin fast enough. When we finally pulled out of the driveway and onto the narrow dirt road leading back to civilization, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin sat there, silent and still, surrounded by trees. But I knew it was watching me. I could feel it. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know it wasn't just my imagination. There's something out there, something that isn't supposed to be, something that's watching the woods, something that's waiting. I had been thinking about it for months, maybe even longer. Finding a cabin tucked deep in the woods, far from the noise and chaos of everyday life. I wanted something off the grid, something quiet. I wasn't exactly sure what I was expecting, but the idea had grown on me like a slow-burning fire. Something about getting away, being alone, seemed so appealing, so calming. So one weekend, I decided to take the plunge. I loaded up my old truck with camping gear, food, a small tent, and a few other supplies. I didn't know exactly where I was headed, but I had a general idea. There were a few cabin listings online, places you could rent or buy, but they were all vague, some just a photo or two and a couple of lines of description. But when it came down to it, I knew it wasn't the website listing that mattered. It was about finding something real, something untouched. I drove through the back roads of the mountains for hours, winding my way deeper and deeper into the dense forest. My truck bumped over dirt roads and gravel paths that had long since been abandoned by civilization. I didn't mind. In fact, I welcomed it. It felt like an adventure, each mile a step further away from the noise of the world. It wasn't until I passed the last little town, where the houses became fewer and fewer, that I started to feel the weight of isolation press in. The trees were thick here, towering above, blocking out any sunlight. The air smelled rich, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. I had no real plan beyond following an old map I had found at the back of a dusty book in a secondhand store. There was a listing on it, marked with a red X, saying something about an old cabin, one that hadn't been touched in years. It was on the edge of a national forest, hidden among the trees. The map didn't give much more detail, but the mystery of it intrigued me. Maybe it was the thrill of the unknown or the idea that I could find something that belonged only to me. Whatever it was, I was determined to track it down. As I got deeper into the forest, the roads grew rougher. I had to take it slow, dodging potholes and rocks that jutted up out of the ground like hidden landmines. The trees were closer now, their trunks wide and ancient, their branches twisting and reaching out like fingers. It felt like the world was closing in around me. The whole place was so still, so quiet. The only sound was the hum of my truck's engine and the occasional crunch of leaves under the tires. The road started to get even narrower, barely wide enough for my truck to fit. It felt like I was driving into a forgotten corner of the world, where nobody had been in years. I kept my eyes on the map, trying to line up the landmarks, but it was getting harder to tell where I was. The trees looked all the same, tall and thick, like they had been there for centuries. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. I had a feeling I was getting close, but there was a nagging doubt that crept in with the silence. There was something unsettling about being out here, so far from anyone else. Eventually, I came across a small clearing. In the middle of it stood an old wooden cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. The walls were weathered, the wood chipped and faded from exposure to the elements. It was exactly what I had imagined, maybe even better. The cabin was small, just one room with a front porch that creaked under the weight of the years. I pulled up slowly, feeling the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. There was no sign of life, no other vehicles, nothing that looked recent. The place looked abandoned, forgotten. I got out of the truck, my boots hitting the ground with a satisfying thud. The air was cooler now, and the quiet was overwhelming. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The cabin, the trees, the open sky above me felt surreal. This was what I had come for. After all, a little piece of solitude in a world that was becoming too loud, too fast. I walked up to the cabin and gave the door a cautious push. It creaked open with surprising ease, revealing the dim interior. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and old wood. There was dust everywhere, on the floor, on the furniture, on the windowsills. A few broken chairs sat against the walls, and a small stone fireplace took up the center of the room. A single window, cracked in one corner, let in a weak stream of light, but it wasn't enough to illuminate the whole space. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years, maybe decades. I stepped inside, my boots tapping against the wooden floor. There was a fireplace on one wall, its stonework worn but still standing. The hearth was cold, empty, like it hadn't seen a fire in ages. I set down my gear by the door, and the floor creaked beneath me. The whole place felt heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I decided to make myself at home, unpacking a few things and lighting a small fire in the stove. The crackling of the fire was a welcome sound, breaking the silence that had settled in around me. I had expected to feel uneasy, but there was something oddly comforting about the cabin, despite its state of decay. It was quiet here, far from the chaos I had left behind. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The evening passed slowly. I sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance. I hadn't planned to stay long, just a night or two to check things out. But as the darkness outside deepened, I began to realize just how isolated I was. There were no roads nearby, no sign of civilization. If something went wrong, there would be no one to help. The thought nagged at me, but I pushed it aside. I had come out here for a reason, after all. I wanted solitude, and here I was. As the fire burned low, I began to feel the weight of the day on my shoulders. I was tired, physically and mentally, and the solitude was starting to feel a little heavier than I had anticipated. The wind outside picked up, rustling the trees, and the old cabin groaned in response. I shook off the feeling of unease and decided to turn in for the night. I grabbed my sleeping bag from my gear and unrolled it on the floor near the fire. The warmth of the embers was enough to keep the chill at bay, and I settled in, pulling the blanket over me. The wind howled outside, but I felt strangely safe in the cabin, like it was a fortress in the middle of the wild. That's when I heard it. A noise, faint at first, just on the edge of hearing. It sounded like something scraping against wood. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a branch rubbing against the cabin's roof. But the noise came again, this time louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind, it was something else. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest. The fire was low now, casting long shadows across the room. I listened, trying to make sense of the sound. It was coming from outside, from the back of the cabin. I could feel my pulse quicken. My instincts told me to stay still, not to make a sound, but I had to know what it was. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight I had brought and turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I crept toward the back door, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. The scraping sound was louder now, almost rhythmic, like something was dragging itself across the ground. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them were good. I peeked through the crack in the door, shining the flashlight across the yard. For a moment, there was nothing, just the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. But then, I saw something, a shape, dark and moving near the edge of the clearing. I froze, holding my breath. The shape didn't move like an animal. It was slower, deliberate, like it was searching for something. I felt a chill run through me, and my instincts screamed at me to get out of there. But I didn't move. I stayed there, watching, waiting. After a few moments, the shape disappeared into the trees. I backed away from the door, my heart racing. I couldn't explain what I had seen, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. The cabin, for all its isolation, was not as empty as I thought. The sound outside stopped, but the unease remained. I wasn't about to stick around any longer than I had to. I packed up quickly, stuffing my gear into my truck without taking my eyes off the surrounding trees. I wasn't sure what was out there, whether it was just a trick of my mind or something more sinister, but I wasn't going to take any chances. The cabin was supposed to be a place of peace, but tonight, it felt like a trap. I didn't look back as I drove away, the headlights cutting through the trees ahead. As the truck rumbled down the road, I felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with an unsettling curiosity. What had I really seen out there? I wasn't sure, but one thing was clear: whatever it was still out there. And the cabin, in all its quiet, lonely beauty, was no place for me anymore. As I made my way back to the main road, I didn't look back once. The cabin was behind me, but it would stay in my mind, lingering like a shadow in the back of my thoughts. Maybe I would come back one day, or maybe not. But I knew for sure that I wouldn't be finding any peace in those woods again anytime soon. I remember my grandpa's old cabin like it was yesterday. It wasn't much to look at. A weathered wooden structure that seemed like it had been standing for ages. Situated deep in the woods, miles from any paved road, it had that rustic, forgotten quality about it. My grandpa had built it with his own hands when he was younger, a place to escape the world and spend some quiet time away from the chaos of everyday life. I'd spent many summers there, playing in the woods, fishing in the nearby creek, and learning life lessons from my grandpa. But when I went back there as an adult, it felt different. The air was heavier, the trees around the cabin seemed to whisper, and the place had an eerie kind of silence that I hadn't noticed before. I wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was just the passage of time, the fact that I was no longer a kid, or maybe it was something more. But it felt like there was a weight to that cabin now, something I couldn't shake. The first time I returned after Grandpa passed away, I went alone. I had been meaning to clear out some of his things, stuff he had left behind after all those years. The thought of it filled me with dread, but I knew it was something I had to do. When I pulled up in my truck, the cabin looked the same. A little worse for wear, but still standing strong. The wood was grayed and cracked from years of weather, but the structure itself hadn't collapsed like I expected. It was still his cabin, still the place I had spent so many summers. I parked the truck near the front, got out, and took a deep breath. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth, with a hint of pine from the trees that surrounded the property. The silence was almost suffocating. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There wasn't a single sound, not even the chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves. Just a deep, unsettling stillness. I shook it off. It was just my nerves. I grabbed the duffel bag from the truck and walked toward the front door. The wood creaked beneath my boots as I stepped onto the porch. The door was ajar, which struck me as odd. I distinctly remembered locking it the last time I was here, but that had been years ago. Still, I shrugged it off. Maybe the lock had worn out, or maybe I hadn't locked it all the way. The inside of the cabin was exactly as I remembered it. The old furniture, scratched, dented, and covered in dust, sat in the same positions. A faded rug lay on the floor, and the fireplace, which my grandpa had spent countless hours tending, was empty and cold. The musty smell of old wood and stale air hit me immediately. It was like stepping back in time. I walked around, touching things, trying to find something that would bring back memories of my grandpa. But nothing felt the same. The place felt off, like it was holding secrets that it didn't want to share. I could feel my unease growing with every step. I decided to head to the back of the cabin and check out the shed where my grandpa used to keep his tools. The door to the shed was locked, which was strange. He never locked it, not even when he wasn't around. It was one of those things he didn't care about. I had a bad feeling about it, but I found the old key he'd left for me years ago. I slid it into the lock, and after a moment's hesitation, I turned it. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed too loudly in the still air. Inside, the shed was filled with old tools. Saws, hammers, nails, and boxes of other bits and pieces my grandpa had collected over the years. But there was something else in there too. A large, rusted metal box sat in the far corner. It wasn't something I'd ever seen before. I walked over to it, my heart racing in my chest. The box was heavy. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There were no markings on it, just a dull, faded metal surface. I crouched down and tried to lift it, but it was bolted shut. My curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed a crowbar that was lying nearby. After a few hard pries, the lid popped open. Inside, there were old papers, documents that looked like they were from a time long before my grandpa had built the cabin. Some of them were yellowed with age, others had holes where insects had eaten through the paper. But one thing stood out. There was a small, weathered photograph of a man standing in front of the cabin, but it wasn't my grandpa. The man looked familiar, though. I couldn't place him, but something about his expression made my skin crawl. His eyes were cold, like he was staring straight into me, and his lips were pulled back in a grin that didn't sit right. I set the photo aside and dug deeper into the box. Underneath the papers, I found a small leather-bound journal. It was old, the leather cracked and worn, and the pages inside were delicate. I opened it carefully and started flipping through the pages. It was written in my grandpa's handwriting, but it didn't make sense at first. The writing was erratic, like he was in a hurry. The entries spoke of strange things happening around the cabin. Unexplained noises, things disappearing and then reappearing, shadows that moved when no one was around. It was nothing like what I remembered about him. He was always a practical man, not one to talk about things like that. The entries became more frantic as I read. One of the last ones I could make out was about a visitor that had come to the cabin. Someone my grandpa had known or thought he had known. The journal didn't say much more, but the implication was clear. Whoever this person was, they had a hold on my grandpa, and whatever was happening in the cabin had nothing to do with nature or the elements. It was something far more disturbing. A chill ran down my spine as I closed the journal. I hadn't felt that sense of dread before, but it was there now, thick in the air. I left the shed quickly and went back inside the cabin, my thoughts swirling. My grandpa had never mentioned any of this to me, and now I was alone in this place, with no one to ask what it all meant. As night fell, the cabin seemed to take on a different life of its own. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, and the house creaked and groaned as if it were alive. The fire in the stove crackled, but it did little to warm the place. It felt colder inside than it had outside. I could hear the distant sound of a branch snapping, the rustling of leaves, but there was no rain, just the wind and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I tried to get some rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that photograph of the man, and I could hear his voice in my head, faint at first but growing louder. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew he was speaking to me. It felt like he was in the cabin with me, just out of sight. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. I packed up the few things I had brought and made my way back to the truck. The woods around the cabin were unnervingly quiet. It was like the forest had gone still, as if it were holding its breath. I glanced back at the cabin one last time, and I swear, for a moment, I saw the curtains move in the window, but no one was there. I left that cabin without a second thought, driving away as fast as I could. When I got back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind, something that needed to be found, something my grandpa had hidden. But I never went back. I don't think I ever will. The cabin, with all its old secrets and strange happenings, belongs to the past now. And I can't help but wonder if some things are better left there, forgotten. The next time I thought about that cabin, I learned that the old man in the photograph had lived there long before my grandpa, someone my grandpa had known from his own past, someone who had disappeared without a trace. What they had left behind, I would never truly understand. It had been a long drive up to the cabin, the kind of drive where the road twists and turns between mountains and thick trees, narrowing as it went deeper into the wilderness. My cousin Dan had invited me to stay for the weekend, telling me that it would be a great chance to get away from everything, relax, and unwind. I didn't have much going on, so I agreed, even though I wasn't really used to being alone in remote places like that. I had stayed in cabins before, but always with others. This would be different. The cabin was older, nestled in a valley and surrounded by dense woods. The air had a crispness to it, the kind that only exists in places far from the noise of civilization. It was a modest place, nothing fancy, just a small wooden structure with a porch, a couple of windows, and a roof that looked like it had seen better days. The kind of cabin you'd expect to find in a horror movie, but one that somehow seemed inviting. There was a woodpile on the side, the scent of fresh pine in the air, and the soft rustling of leaves when the wind blew. A small creek babbled nearby, adding a peaceful background noise to the quietness. Felt safe, for a while. When I first arrived, Dan wasn't there yet. He was supposed to come up later that night. I had the place to myself for a few hours. The moment I stepped inside, the smell of old wood hit me, mixed with the faint scent of something earthy and musty. The place had that old, lived-in vibe, with furniture that looked like it had been passed down for generations. The cabin was clean, but not the kind of clean you get from professional cleaners. More like the kind of clean a person would keep it if they lived there long enough to know the little quirks of the place. The floors creaked under my feet as I walked around. The air was cool but not uncomfortable, and the lighting was dim, with only a few lamps scattered around. Felt isolated, but in a comfortable way, like the world outside didn't really matter. I made myself a simple meal just to pass the time. It was quiet, the kind of silence that's almost too loud when you're alone. There was no television, no radio, nothing but the sounds of nature outside. I sat by the window, looking out at the darkening woods, trying to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was because I hadn't been truly alone for a while. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach, like something wasn't right. I dismissed it, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of being alone in such a remote place. The thought of Dan showing up soon gave me some comfort. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed a car's headlights coming down the gravel road. At first, I thought it was Dan, but the car didn't slow down when it passed the cabin. It just kept going, down the winding road, its headlights disappearing into the darkness. It wasn't until the sound of the engine faded that I realized it didn't seem like someone who was just passing through. It was strange. The cabin was so isolated. There wasn't any reason for anyone to be out here this late. I brushed it off as some random traveler and went about setting up the small fire pit in the yard. By the time I had a small fire going, the night had fully settled in. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground, and the woods felt like they were closing in around me. I sat by the fire for a while, my thoughts drifting. The warmth from the fire was comforting, but that nagging feeling from earlier didn't go away. Then, out of nowhere, I heard footsteps. It was faint at first, like the sound of someone walking through the woods, but the quietness of the area made it stand out. I stood up quickly, my heart rate speeding up. I didn't see anything at first, just the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. But then I saw him, a man standing just outside the circle of light from the fire. He was tall, thin, and dressed in dark clothes that blended into the night. I couldn't make out his face, but I could see his figure clearly against the backdrop of the trees. I froze. My mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. Was he lost? Did he need help? Or was he someone who had been lurking around, watching me? It didn't make sense. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, and it was as if the world had gone silent again, like the night itself was holding its breath. I felt a chill run down my spine. For what felt like forever, neither of us moved. Then, without a word, the man turned and walked back into the woods, his steps fading into the distance. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to calm my racing heart, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe he was just a wanderer, someone who got lost in the woods. But why had he been watching me? And why hadn't he said anything? Dan didn't show up until much later, after midnight. He had been delayed, but he seemed fine, nothing out of the ordinary. He didn't even notice anything was off. I didn't tell him about the man I had seen. Maybe I just needed to sleep and get over it, I thought. But the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the woods. It was subtle, like something was watching, but every time I looked around, I saw nothing. That evening, after a full day of hiking, Dan and I settled in for the night. I didn't mention the man to him again, but my anxiety was creeping back. I couldn't stop thinking about those footsteps, the way he had just stood there, watching. It was as though he was waiting for something. The cabin felt smaller somehow, the walls too close. The windows, which I had initially thought were charming, now seemed like a trap, offering no escape. Around 10 p.m., I heard something at the door. It wasn't a knock, more like the sound of someone gently tapping on the wood. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, louder this time. I froze, my pulse quickening. Dan was in the other room, unaware as usual. The tapping continued, rhythmic, almost deliberate. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I slowly moved toward the door. I didn't know what to expect, but I had a feeling it wasn't good. I peered through the peephole. There was nothing, just darkness. But then, I heard something from the other side, a faint rustling. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I couldn't think straight. I grabbed the phone and called Dan. When he answered, I tried to sound calm, but my voice cracked. He was confused, asking if I was okay, telling me to relax. I didn't have the courage to tell him what was really going on. What if I was just being paranoid? What if it was nothing? The night dragged on. The tapping stopped, but my nerves were on edge. Every little noise sent my heart racing. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember was Dan shaking me awake early the next morning. "Did you hear that last night?" he asked. I nodded. I didn't need to explain what had happened. He said he thought he heard something too, but he didn't want to wake me. We checked the cabin's perimeter, but nothing seemed out of place. The door was still locked, and there were no signs of anyone being around. I wanted to believe it was nothing, but the nagging feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I didn't know who the man was or what he wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to stay another night in that cabin. Dan agreed. We packed up and left by the afternoon. The drive back down the winding road felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man. Who was he? Why had he been there? And why had he been watching me? I never went back to that cabin. It stayed in my mind for years, an unresolved mystery that would always haunt me. The man never returned, but his presence stayed with me, a reminder of that strange, unsettling weekend in the woods. And I couldn't help but wonder, was he just passing through, or had he been watching the cabin long before I ever arrived? The first time I went to my dad's cabin, I was about 12 years old. We used to visit often in the summers, but this time I was going alone. My dad had offered me the chance to stay by myself for the weekend while he had to work. It wasn't the first time I had stayed there, but it was the first time I would be completely alone. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, a place so isolated that when you looked out from the porch, the trees stretched out in every direction for miles. My dad had built it himself when I was just a baby, so it had this old, familiar charm to it. I remember the scent of pine that always lingered in the air, mixed with the faint smell of wood and earth. The cabin itself was a rustic structure. Wooden beams, a slanted roof, a wraparound porch. It wasn't fancy, but it felt safe, cozy. Felt like home. It was a Friday afternoon when I arrived. The sky was overcast, and the air had that cool, crisp feeling that came before a storm. I pulled up to the cabin in my old truck and parked in front of the small wooden steps leading up to the porch. The place was quiet, just the way I liked it. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig from the dense forest surrounding me. I grabbed my bag and walked up the steps. The door creaked as I opened it, a sound that always seemed to welcome me in, no matter how many times I had heard it. Inside, everything was just as I remembered. An old couch by the fireplace, a table in the center of the room, a few chairs scattered around. The place was simple but comfortable. My dad had never been one for unnecessary decoration. The walls were adorned with a few old pictures, some of our family, others of places he had traveled to in his younger days. I set my bag down and took a deep breath. Felt good to be there. Felt like a place where I could truly relax. I threw a couple of logs into the fireplace, and as the fire crackled to life, I sat down on the couch, feeling the warmth spread through the room. I looked out the window at the forest, which was already starting to look more ominous as the clouds gathered overhead. The trees swayed slightly in the wind, and I couldn't help but wonder what was out there. There had always been stories in the town about strange things happening in those woods. Disappearances, strange sounds in the night, people saying they saw something moving between the trees. But I didn't let that bother me. I knew that people were just paranoid. I spent most of the evening inside, reading a book by the fire, the rain starting to patter against the roof as the storm rolled in. The wind picked up as the night went on, making the trees groan and creak. It wasn't long before the rain turned into a full-blown downpour, the sound of it drowning out everything else. I remember feeling the cabin sway slightly in the wind, but I wasn't scared. I was used to it by then. I ate a quick dinner, just some canned beans and crackers, and settled in for the night. The storm outside made everything feel cozier inside, like the cabin was a safe haven from whatever was happening out there. But then, around midnight, something changed. I was just starting to drift off to sleep when I heard a noise. Something subtle, but distinct enough to pull me out of my half-sleep. It wasn't the wind or the rain. It was a tapping sound, almost rhythmic, coming from somewhere outside. At first, I thought it was just the branches of the trees hitting the roof, but as the tapping continued, it felt different. More deliberate, like someone or something was out there. I sat up, my heart beating a little faster now. I listened closely, straining to hear. The tapping didn't stop. It was coming from the side of the cabin. I stood up slowly, careful not to make a sound. I walked over to the window, careful not to move the curtain too much. I peered out into the dark night, my eyes scanning the tree line. All I could see was the rain pouring down and the occasional flicker of lightning in the distance. Nothing. I stood there for a long moment, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. Maybe it was just an animal, a raccoon or something, tapping against the wood. It wasn't uncommon to hear animals trying to get inside the cabin. But still, something didn't sit right. The tapping wasn't random. It was like it was being done on purpose. I backed away from the window and sat back down on the couch, trying to calm my nerves. But the noise didn't stop. It went on for what felt like hours, echoing through the night. The rain pounded against the roof, but the tapping remained clear, persistent. It was driving me crazy. Couldn't ignore it. Finally, I decided to go check it out. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and headed toward the door, my mind racing with every step. I opened it cautiously, trying not to make too much noise. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I pushed through, stepping out onto the porch. The wind howled, and the rain hit my face in cold sheets. I pointed the flashlight into the dark, my hand trembling slightly as I held it steady. The light flickered in the storm, casting eerie shadows across the trees. I looked around the side of the cabin, trying to make sense of the tapping sound. There was nothing there, just trees, darkness, and the sound of the storm. I walked further along the edge, shining the light into the shadows. Nothing. Then I heard it again. It came from behind me, a loud bang that made me spin around. My heart was in my throat now, and I was frozen, staring into the night. There was something out there, I was sure of it. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an odd scraping sound, like something dragging across the ground. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it, like something was watching me from the woods. I started to head back inside, but then I heard footsteps, heavy ones. Not the kind of footsteps you'd expect from an animal. These were deliberate, human-like. I turned back around, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and shined it into the trees. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement, something shifting behind the trunks of the trees. But when I tried to focus on it, it was gone. My breath caught in my chest, and I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself. My heart was racing, my thoughts spinning. I had to be imagining things. There was no way anyone else could be out there. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening for any signs of movement outside. The tapping, the footsteps, they never came back. But the unease stayed with me, lingering in the dark corners of the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. The next morning, I woke up to a quiet, overcast sky. The storm had passed, but the air was still thick and damp. I stepped outside, still feeling that uneasy sense of being watched. The woods were calm now, almost too calm. I walked around the cabin, trying to convince myself that I had just let my imagination run wild. But as I rounded the back corner, my heart stopped. There, just under the window where I had heard the tapping, were deep scratches on the wood, long, jagged lines, as if something had dragged its claws across it. I didn't stay there another night. I packed up my things and left the cabin that morning, the unease still gnawing at me. As I drove back toward the town, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, something that had watched me all night, waiting. I haven't been back to that cabin since, and I don't plan on going back anytime soon. But every now and then, I'll hear a sound in the woods, a tap, a scratch, something in the distance that sends a chill down my spine. And I wonder if what I heard that night was just my imagination, or if there's something out there in the woods that's still waiting. The night I spent alone in the cabin still sticks with me, even though it's been years. I had rented this cabin deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, just for some peace and quiet. I'd been feeling run down, mentally and physically. The idea of escaping into the wilderness, even for just a few days, was too tempting to pass up. I figured a few days alone with nothing but the sounds of nature would do me some good. The cabin itself was basic. A small, wooden building tucked between towering pines, with a stone fireplace that looked like it had been used for generations. It had a few small rooms, one with a simple bed, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom that was more of an afterthought than anything else. There was a porch that wrapped around the front of the cabin, with a couple of chairs that overlooked the dense forest. Nothing fancy, just a quiet, secluded place to unwind. When I arrived, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the property. The air had a fresh, earthy smell that only deep forests seemed to have, a scent I hadn't realized I missed until I breathed it in. I unloaded my bags, set up a little campfire outside to cook some dinner, and took a walk around the area. The forest around the cabin was thick with trees, their trunks dark and ancient, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. It felt peaceful, but a part of me also felt this strange, uneasy feeling creeping up. It wasn't that I was scared, but there was something about being so far out in the middle of nowhere that made me aware of my vulnerability. As the night grew darker, I retreated into the cabin. The fire I had started outside crackled through the window, but inside, it was quiet, too quiet. The cabin creaked with the sounds of settling wood, but that was to be expected in an old building like this. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I went to bed early that night, hoping to shake the odd sensation I'd been carrying all day. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound that made my heart skip. It was a thud, soft at first, then a series of quick, sharp noises that followed. I lay still in bed, listening, but everything else was silent. My first thought was that it was just some animal outside, maybe a deer or a raccoon messing around. But as the thuds continued, they didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. They were too regular, too deliberate. I lay there, listening intently, trying to ignore the racing thoughts in my head. Was it a person? But who would be out here, miles away from anything, in the middle of the night? It didn't make sense. The sound eventually stopped, and I managed to drift back to sleep, though it wasn't a restful sleep. I kept waking up, checking the time, staring out the window into the darkness, but nothing happened. The forest outside seemed even quieter now, almost unnaturally still. The next day, I tried to shake off the unease. I spent the morning exploring the woods around the cabin, trying to ignore the way every creaking branch and distant rustle seemed to make me jump. It was hard to concentrate on anything, my mind constantly wandering back to the sound I had heard the night before. I kept telling myself it was nothing, probably just an animal, maybe a bear or some other large creature. By the afternoon, I'd found a small clearing not far from the cabin and decided to sit down and have some lunch. The sun was higher in the sky, warming the earth and filling the air with the smell of pine and moss. For a moment, I felt peaceful again, like I was getting back to the purpose of the trip. But then I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the dirt, deep impressions in the soft earth, leading away from the clearing and toward the cabin. At first, I thought it could have been a deer, but as I knelt down to examine them closer, I saw that the prints were too large, too round. They didn't look like any animal tracks I'd seen before, and they were too fresh, like whoever or whatever had made them had walked through only moments before. I followed the tracks, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach with each step. They led straight to the cabin, stopping just at the edge of the porch. There were no other prints, no sign of where the person had gone after that. It was as if they had just disappeared. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot, but nothing seemed to make sense. That evening, I decided to stay inside. The feeling that something wasn't right had settled deep in my chest, and I couldn't shake it. I made dinner, ate quickly, and then sat by the fire, trying to distract myself. But the stillness of the cabin was suffocating. Every small sound seemed amplified. Every crack of the wood, every gust of wind, every shift in the floorboards. Around 10 p.m., I heard the thud again. This time, it was closer. I stood frozen in my seat, straining my ears, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The thuds grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like someone was walking around the cabin, moving slowly but deliberately. I couldn't tell if it was outside or inside. My heart started to pound, and I had to force myself to stay calm. I grabbed the flashlight that was sitting on the coffee table and made my way to the door. I opened it carefully, shining the beam into the night. There was nothing, just the empty forest, the same as it had been before. But the thuds continued, only now they sounded even closer. I didn't know if I should stay or leave. My mind was racing. Should I go out and check the perimeter? Should I just lock the door and wait for the morning? I stood there for a long time, the flashlight trembling in my hand, but eventually, the noise stopped. The air grew colder, and a sense of dread seemed to settle over the cabin, heavy and thick. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the figure outside the cabin, just beyond the reach of the light, watching me. I knew I couldn't stay here anymore, but I also knew there was no way I'd make it back to town in the dark. The road was rough, and I'd only barely managed to get in here with daylight to spare. There was no way I could drive out safely now. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of the cabin, waiting for dawn. As soon as the first rays of light crept through the window, I packed up my things as quickly as I could. I was out of there in under an hour, barely sparing a glance at the cabin before I slammed the door behind me and headed toward my car. The drive back to town was quiet, but I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. I never went back to that cabin. The strange noises, the footprints, and the feeling of being watched were too much for me. It wasn't the kind of place I could relax in. It felt wrong, like I wasn't meant to be there. A few weeks later, I did some research on the area, trying to find out if anyone else had ever reported strange happenings in those woods. I didn't find anything specific, but there were a few scattered stories about people feeling like they were being watched, strange noises in the night, and the occasional unexplained disappearance of animals. Nothing concrete, but enough to make my skin crawl. I never did find out what was out there, but I know one thing for sure. Something was, and whatever it was, I never want to be that close to it again. The night was quiet, too quiet. It had been a long day hiking, and the cabin, nestled deep in the woods, felt like a place where the world had forgotten about you. I was alone, a decision I'd made for some peace and solitude. I had planned on staying for a couple of days, escaping the noise of the city and enjoying the crisp, fresh air of the mountain range. I'd built a fire to ward off the chill of the evening, the crackling of the logs breaking the silence. The cabin was small but cozy, with a couple of chairs, a small table, and a wood stove in the corner that kept the place warm. The windows were dark, and outside, nothing could be seen except the thick blackness of the woods. It was one of those kinds of nights where you can hear every little sound amplified by the silence around you. I kept my eyes on the fire for a long time, my mind drifting back to the trail I'd hiked earlier that day. It had been peaceful out there, serene almost, but something about this cabin felt different. Something felt off. The air outside had grown colder, and the fire crackled louder, the occasional ember shooting up into the air. I took a slow breath, letting the warmth seep into my bones, trying to relax. I'd been hearing little things in the woods, nothing specific, just an occasional rustling or snap of a twig. It wasn't anything unusual, though. Animals were everywhere up here, but there was something in the air tonight. It wasn't the usual hum of nocturnal creatures that I was used to. This was different. There was a certain stillness, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stood still, trying to listen through the crackling fire. It had started again, a soft rustling, much closer this time. I froze, staring at the door. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, nothing that could explain the sound. It was more like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. My stomach turned. I glanced over to the small gun on the table. I wasn't much of a shooter, but I had it with me just in case. I tried to push the thought out of my head, telling myself it was just an animal. But the more I listened, the more certain I became. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't the usual crunch of a deer's hooves or the scamper of a raccoon. This was something heavier, slower, something that was circling me, moving deliberately. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and slowly stood up, making sure not to make any sudden movements. The beam of light cut through the cabin's dimness, casting shadows across the walls. My heart beat faster as I stepped toward the window, cautiously pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The beam of light swept across the trees, the dense undergrowth, but there was nothing visible. I exhaled, trying to calm myself down, but the knot in my stomach only tightened. My mind kept playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just the wind, a bear, or some other animal out there. But then it happened again, the unmistakable crunch of something heavy moving in the underbrush, just outside the cabin's walls. I froze again, my hand gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles turned white. There was something wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. I stepped back from the window, my eyes darting toward the door. The last thing I wanted to do was open that door. But I also needed to know what was out there. The sound of movement grew louder, closer. The unmistakable sound of something or someone moving in a way that didn't sound like any animal I knew. It was as if the creature was trying to keep its presence a secret, moving carefully, staying in the shadows. I could hear it, shifting, sliding between the trees. The steps were slow but deliberate. Then the sound stopped. Dead silence followed. For what seemed like an eternity, the world outside my cabin was still. The fire crackled on, its warmth barely enough to calm the sense of dread creeping up my spine. Then it came, a scraping sound, sharp and quick, like claws against wood. I jumped, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't on the door, though. It was the side of the cabin. Something was scratching at the wood, slow and deliberate, like it was trying to find a way in. My mind raced. What the hell was that? I swallowed hard, my throat dry, the panic creeping in. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a bear or something, just curious. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. No bear scratched the side of a cabin like that with such intent. I slowly made my way toward the back door, trying not to make any noise. I had to know what was out there. If it was an animal, I could deal with it. But if it wasn't, if it was something else, I hesitated for a moment before grabbing the handle and pulling the door open a crack. The darkness outside seemed to swallow the beam of my flashlight. It was thick, impenetrable, like there was something hiding in that blackness, something waiting. I stepped outside, my feet crunching on the gravel path. The sound stopped, complete silence again. I stood there, staring into the abyss of the forest, waiting for any sign, any movement. A minute passed, then two, still nothing. I was about to turn back inside, thinking maybe I was just imagining things, when I saw it. A shape in the distance, standing between two trees. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its body a dark silhouette against the forest backdrop. It wasn't moving, it was just standing there, facing the cabin, watching. I froze, unable to breathe. I couldn't see any details in the darkness, but the shape was unmistakable. It wasn't a tree, it wasn't a rock, and it sure as hell wasn't an animal. It was something else, something human, yet wrong. Its posture was too rigid, too still, like it was waiting for something. The creature didn't move. It just stood there, as if it had no intention of leaving. I felt the air grow colder around me, my breath coming out in shallow bursts. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Slowly, the figure shifted. It didn't walk. It just seemed to slide slightly, moving in a way that didn't seem natural, like its joints weren't bending quite right. I stumbled backward, heart pounding in my chest. I knew I couldn't just stand there. I couldn't risk whatever that thing was getting any closer. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me, and turned to grab my phone. I dialed the number of the only neighbor I had up here. The phone rang and rang, but no one answered. I tried again. Still nothing. I checked the windows, the door, every corner of the cabin. It was as if the entire world outside had gone still, waiting. I sat down by the fire, trying to steady my breathing. I had no idea what I had just seen, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't normal. Nothing about it made sense. And whatever it wasn't leaving. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. I didn't sleep, couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that silhouette standing out in the woods. And every time I opened them, the forest outside remained as silent and impenetrable as before. By morning, the creature was gone. The sun rose, casting a warm light through the trees. But I knew better than to believe that meant everything was normal again. The woods still felt off, the quiet too thick to ignore. I packed up my things quickly, my hands shaking as I gathered what little I had unpacked. I wasn't staying another night. I didn't care if I had to leave everything behind. My gear, the cabin, everything. I wasn't risking whatever that thing was. As I drove away, looking back at the cabin one last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was still out there, waiting, watching, and I wasn't sure I'd ever really be alone again. I had never been so alone in my life. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, just me and my dog, Max. We had rented this cabin deep in the woods, an old, secluded place, surrounded by thick trees that felt like they could close in on you at any moment. I liked it that way, though. I was the kind of person who enjoyed the quiet, the solitude. It gave me space to think and recharge. The cabin was small, with rough-hewn wooden beams and a stone fireplace that looked like it belonged in a much older house. There was a slight creak in the floorboards every time you stepped in certain places, but I liked that too. It added character. The windows had thick curtains, but I kept them open to let in the light. Outside, everything was calm. The sun was setting, casting a soft, orange glow across the trees. The evening air was crisp, and the only sounds were the rustling of the leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. Max, my German shepherd, was already lying on the rug in front of the fireplace. He was calm, as usual, and I felt safe with him around. We had been hiking through the woods earlier in the day, and he was content now, tired from the walk. I figured we'd settle in, enjoy a quiet evening, maybe have a drink or two, and get some sleep before heading back home the next day. I didn't expect what happened next. The first thing I noticed was how quiet everything became. I'm talking about dead silence, the kind of quiet where even the usual forest noises seemed to disappear. It wasn't just the lack of birds or wind, it was deeper than that. Unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. Max's ears perked up, and he lifted his head, eyes scanning the cabin, his body stiffening as if he sensed something I couldn't. I froze for a moment, unsure of what was happening. Was it just my nerves playing tricks on me? I told myself it had to be. After all, I was deep in the woods, far from any real civilization. I had been out here before, camping and hiking, and never had I felt anything like this. But Max wasn't just reacting to some noise. He was on alert, and I could feel the tension in the air. I decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside onto the porch, trying to steady my nerves. The temperature had dropped a little since sunset, and I could see my breath in the air. Max followed me, but he stayed close to my side, walking quietly as we scanned the woods around us. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. The forest was as still as ever, and the trees loomed tall and dark against the evening sky. I was about to turn back when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A shape, standing just beyond the tree line, a shadow almost blending with the forest. At first, I thought it was just another deer or some other animal, but then it shifted in a way that made my heart race. The shape didn't move like a deer. It was too tall, too wrong. The outline was distinct now, a massive figure standing upright like a person, but its posture was off, unnatural. Its head was tilted slightly, and I could see the glint of what looked like eyes too large, too intense. Max let out a low growl, the sound vibrating through his chest. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, my fingers starting to sweat. The figure didn't move, just stared, and the more I looked, the more I felt a sense of dread growing in my stomach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of animal I didn't recognize, something I hadn't seen before, but this didn't feel like an animal. There was something about it, something primal and terrifying. The eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, almost reflecting the light from my flashlight, and I couldn't look away. My body was frozen, as if some invisible force had rooted me to the spot. Max's growling grew louder, more urgent, but still the figure didn't move. It stood there, unmoving, its eyes locked onto mine. And then, something I will never forget. The thing slowly tilted its head, as if studying me, and that's when I saw it. Its face, or at least what I could make out of it in the low light, wasn't human. It was like a grotesque mask with the shape of a wolf or some other wild animal, but with features that seemed far too exaggerated. Its eyes weren't just large. They were too wide, too deep. There was an intelligence behind them, something that sent a shiver down my spine. I felt my breath catch in my throat, the air thickening with fear. My mind screamed at me to run, to get inside, to lock the door and hide. But I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from those eyes. And then it happened. The figure took a step forward. Just one slow, deliberate step, but that was all it took to shatter the last bit of my rational thinking. I backed up, my legs shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. Max barked now, a sharp, desperate sound, but it didn't seem to faze the creature. Took another step forward, and I finally snapped out of my trance. "Max, come!" I shouted, and grabbed the leash I had left on the porch, pulling him toward the cabin. As we scrambled to the door, I heard something I will never forget. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving through the forest toward me. It wasn't the sound of a human footfall. It was more like the pounding of something far bigger, far stronger, and it was getting closer. I managed to get the door open, slamming it shut behind me with a loud bang. Inside, I locked the door and turned off the flashlight, my breathing erratic. Max stood by my side, still growling, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting the creature to burst through at any moment. But the footsteps stopped. The forest outside was eerily silent once again. I stood there, heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It didn't feel real. Nothing about this felt real. Was it a bear? A wolf? I had no idea. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just some wild animal. It was something else, something wrong. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise, every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves outside sent me into a panic. Max was restless too, constantly alert, his ears twitching at every sound. I kept the lights on in the cabin, and I stayed awake, hoping that whatever it was would move on, that I could just survive the night and leave in the morning. But the thing never came back. The next day, when the sunlight broke through the trees, I felt a little safer. I didn't know if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or if I had imagined it all in a panic. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. That thing, whatever it was still out there. I left the cabin early, not even bothering to finish my weekend. I packed up quickly, Max sitting quietly by my side, still uneasy, but not growling anymore. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature standing in the woods, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the woods, dark and silent. Even now, whenever I think back on that night, I can't explain it. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man. It was something else entirely. And I know, deep down, I'll never really understand what I saw in those woods. But I'll never forget the eyes. The way they locked onto me, the way they seemed to see right through me. And I'll never forget how, for a moment, I was completely helpless. The night had already settled deep over the forest when I first noticed it. The cabin was small, tucked away in a clearing surrounded by dense woods. I had come here to escape the rush of life, the noise of the city, and the constant pressure that seemed to follow me wherever I went. This cabin was supposed to be my refuge, a place to recharge, to think, to breathe. But as the days passed, I started to feel something wasn't quite right. It started with the noises. At first, they seemed harmless enough. Just the wind rustling through the trees, or maybe a squirrel running along the roof. But then, on the third night, I heard something different. It was a low, guttural growl, distant but close enough to make me freeze in place. I figured it was just a bear or some other animal. But then I heard it again, this time closer. The growl wasn't normal, it wasn't an animal I recognized. It was deep, almost like it was coming from something much larger than any creature I had ever heard. I got up from the couch where I had been reading and peered through the window. The moonlight barely filtered through the trees, casting strange shadows that danced and twisted. Nothing stood out, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. My instincts told me to lock the doors, but I hesitated. I didn't want to be paranoid. The next day, I decided to explore the woods around the cabin, just to get a better sense of the area. The woods were thick, the trees towering and ancient. There was a trail, faint and overgrown, that seemed to lead into the deeper parts of the forest. I followed it, the scent of pine and earth filling my lungs with every breath. I didn't go far, just enough to get a feel for the surroundings. I came across an old log, half-rotted and covered with moss. As I sat down on it to rest, I noticed something odd. Tracks. Large, deep tracks that didn't look like any animal I had seen before. They were too big to be a bear, too wide for a deer. I leaned in closer, squinting at the odd shape of the prints. They looked almost human, but with claws at the end, sharp and curved. I stood up quickly, the unease that had been growing in me all week now turning into full-blown fear. My heart raced, my throat tight. I didn't stay long after that. The feeling that something was wrong, something was out there, was overwhelming. I made my way back to the cabin, trying to shake off the strange sensation, but the air felt heavier now, thick with an unsettling tension. That night, I locked the doors and pulled the curtains tight. I made sure the windows were sealed and that the small, stone fireplace in the corner was stoked with a fresh batch of wood. But the sound came again, closer this time. The growl. It rumbled in the distance, deep and menacing. My pulse quickened. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a wolf or a coyote, but the sound didn't feel right. It was too deliberate, too controlled. Then it started pacing, around the cabin. I could hear it, its claws scraping against the wooden floor outside. Heavy, thudding steps, walking in circles, almost as if it were inspecting the cabin. My breath hitched in my chest, and I pressed my back to the wall, not daring to move, barely daring to breathe. I had no idea what was out there, but it was close, very close. The growling stopped, and then came the scratching, the unmistakable sound of claws raking across the wood, slow and steady, like it was toying with me. I held my breath, straining my ears to hear through the silence, and then I heard it, a heavy, labored breathing, right outside the window. I couldn't see anything. The window was too small, and the darkness was too thick. But I could feel it. Whatever it was there. I felt its eyes, piercing through the darkness, staring into me. My hands trembled, and I fought the urge to flee, knowing I would be dead before I made it outside. Then, with a sudden, bone-chilling shriek, the creature charged. The wood on the front door rattled violently, as though it were slamming against it. I jumped back, falling to the floor, my mind racing with terror. Whatever it was strong, and it was not backing down. I scrambled to my feet, my body moving almost on instinct. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter, holding it out in front of me like it would do anything to stop this thing. But I knew deep down that there was nothing I could do to stop it. This thing wasn't something that could be fought with a knife. This was something ancient, something wrong, something I had no business encountering. The growling continued outside. It was a constant, deep vibration in the air, like the earth itself was shaking under its power. Then, the sound of footsteps, heavy, slow, deliberate, echoed around the cabin. I stayed completely still, hardly daring to blink, my breath barely a whisper. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The growling, the scratching, the footsteps, all of it ceased. The silence was deafening, so complete that I almost couldn't process it. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move, too scared to check outside. I just waited. The moonlight through the window had shifted, casting a faint glow on the porch. I saw something, a shape, something tall, crouching just beyond the reach of the light. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the moon. It was watching me, and I could feel it, the predatory intent, the hunger in its gaze. This wasn't just a wild animal. This was something else. But then it turned. Slowly, deliberately, it moved away from the window, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. I didn't wait a second longer. I bolted out of the cabin and into the woods, running with everything I had in me. I had no plan, no direction, but I knew one thing. I wasn't staying in that cabin. Not with that thing out there. I ran until my lungs burned, my legs ached, until the light of the moon barely pierced the trees. I couldn't hear anything anymore. The growls, the footsteps, the heavy breathing, all gone. Just the sound of my own heart pounding in my chest and the night air rushing past me. But I didn't stop. Couldn't look back. I didn't want to know what was following me. Eventually, I found the road. I didn't even know how far I had run. But there it was, a narrow, winding dirt road that led back to the highway. I didn't care about anything else. I just wanted to get out of the woods. I flagged down a passing car, and within minutes, I was in the back seat, speeding away from that cabin, from that thing. I never went back to that place. Couldn't. The memory of that creature, those eyes, the feeling of being hunted, it's something I can't shake. Sometimes, I still hear that growl, echoing in the back of my mind, and I know deep down that whatever it was, it's still out there, watching, waiting. The wind was howling through the trees when I arrived at the cabin, a small, secluded place far from any town. I had rented it for a few days, wanting some peace and quiet. The cabin was tucked deep in the forest, nestled between two tall ridges, with only a narrow, overgrown road leading to it. The sky was an angry gray, the clouds heavy with rain, which wasn't a surprise. The weather had been unpredictable, but it didn't matter. I needed time alone, time to clear my head. The place was exactly what I expected. Old and creaky, with wooden beams that groaned under every step. There was a fireplace in the corner, and a couple of well-worn chairs scattered around the main room. The kitchen was small, with old cabinets and a table that had seen better days. I set my things down, unpacked my bag, and made a fire. It crackled to life quickly, and the warmth from the flames spread through the room, pushing back the chill that had followed me inside. I had hoped for solitude, but as the day went on, a strange feeling began to creep over me, something I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was just the isolation or the weight of the storm outside, but something about the cabin felt wrong, off-kilter. It wasn't the structure. Everything seemed solid enough, though worn and faded. It wasn't the surroundings either. The woods outside were thick and dark, but that's exactly what I expected. The evening passed quietly, with me reading by the fire. The wind howled louder, and the rain began to pour in sheets, drumming against the roof with a constant, rhythmic beat. I finished my dinner, washed the dishes, and tried to settle down for the night. The only light came from the fire and a small lamp beside the couch, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it, the faint sound of tapping. At first, I thought it was just the storm, the rain hitting the windows in a way that made it sound like someone was knocking. But when the tapping came again, sharper this time, I sat up, my pulse quickening. It wasn't a gust of wind or the rain against the wood. It was distinct, deliberate. I got up, moving quietly across the room to the window. I peered through the glass, squinting into the dark, but I saw nothing. The trees swayed in the wind, but there was no sign of anyone outside. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but my nerves were on edge now. Maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on me. I tried to shake it off and went back to the fire, but the tapping came again, louder this time, right at the window. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone was out there. I grabbed the nearest thing to me, an old fireplace poker, and moved cautiously toward the door. I opened it slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, the rain pouring down in sheets. I squinted into the darkness, but there was nothing. No person, no movement, just the relentless storm. I stepped out, feeling the cold rain soak through my clothes immediately. My breath formed visible clouds in the frigid air. The wind tugged at my jacket as I made my way around the cabin, checking every corner. Nothing seemed out of place, no sign of anyone, but the feeling, the one that had been nagging at me all evening, still lingered, tightening in my chest like a vice. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I glanced around the room, but nothing had changed. The fire still crackled in the hearth, and the lamp still cast its soft glow. I sat down, trying to calm my nerves, but the uneasy feeling didn't leave. I kept hearing sounds, the faint tapping, the rustling of something just outside the walls, something that didn't quite belong. I tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay in bed, the covers pulled tight around me, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the cabin made my heart race. Every gust of wind made me tense, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The storm raged on and the night dragged by. It wasn't until around 2 a.m. that I finally heard it. The tapping again, but this time it was different. It wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from inside the cabin. My blood ran cold. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears to listen. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of something scraping against the wood, slow and deliberate. I couldn't tell exactly where it was coming from. The walls, the floorboards, the ceiling, every part of the cabin seemed to be closing in on me. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to gather my thoughts, but panic was starting to creep in. I wasn't alone. I sat up in bed, my fingers gripping the edge of the covers. I couldn't stay here. I needed to get out, but the storm was still relentless, and I didn't want to step into the darkness without knowing what was happening inside. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, followed by a soft shuffling noise, like something moving across the floor. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the poker again, my grip tight around the cold metal. My mind raced as I moved quietly toward the sound, trying to steady my breathing. I reached the door to the main room and slowly pushed it open, my eyes scanning the dim light. The fire had died down to a low glow, casting long shadows across the room. That's when I saw it. At the far side of the room, by the old chair near the fireplace, there was a figure, a man. He was standing perfectly still just outside the firelight, his back to me. My blood froze. His presence was almost surreal, like he didn't belong in this place, like he was a part of the darkness itself. I couldn't make out his features clearly. He was wearing a dark jacket, his hands at his sides. His hair was wild, like he had been out in the storm for a long time, and his clothes were torn, as if he had been crawling through the woods. The most disturbing part, though, was the shard of glass he was holding in one hand, the jagged edge catching the dim light as he moved it slowly in front of him, almost like he was inspecting it. I stood there, frozen, my heart thundering in my chest. I didn't know what to do, whether to confront him or run. But before I could make a decision, he turned his head slightly, just enough that I could see his face. It was gaunt, pale, the skin stretched tight across his bones. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on something I couldn't see. There was a madness in them, a wildness that sent a chill down my spine. His lips were parted in a half-smile, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It was something darker, something unsettling. I didn't know who he was or how he had gotten into the cabin. I didn't know if he was dangerous, but everything in me screamed that he was. The shard of glass in his hand seemed to glow in the dim light, sharp and threatening. He took a step forward, and I instinctively took a step back, my heart racing. My eyes locked onto the shard, and I knew, without a doubt, that he was capable of using it. But then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he stopped. He stood still again, like he was waiting for something. His gaze shifted toward the fire, and he stared at it, his expression softening. For a moment, it almost seemed like he wasn't even aware of me. That's when I saw it, the escape, the window. I moved quickly, silently, backing away from him, keeping my eyes on the man. I made my way toward the window at the far side of the cabin, the one I had checked earlier. My heart pounded in my chest, every step feeling like it took forever. When I reached it, I yanked the window open, the glass rattling as I forced it up. I didn't hesitate. I climbed through the window and into the rain-soaked night. The storm was fierce, the wind howling like a beast, but I didn't care. I ran through the mud, the rain stinging my face, my heart pounding in my chest. The woods around me seemed alive, the trees bending under the wind, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I reached the road, where a car was coming toward me, its headlights cutting through the dark. I flagged it down, and the driver pulled over, looking at me with concern. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. They gave me a ride to the nearest town, and I didn't return to that cabin. I don't know what happened to that man, or why he was there. I don't know if he was lost or if he was something more dangerous, but I'll never forget his eyes, the way he stood there, holding that shard of glass, watching me like he was waiting for me to make the first move. I never went back to the cabin, and I never want to. It was the kind of cabin you'd find in the middle of nowhere, nestled between a dense forest and the base of a rocky hill. No neighbors, no distractions, just isolation. I'd booked it for the weekend with the hope of getting some peace and quiet. I needed to get away from the noise of the city to reset my mind. So, when I arrived and saw the small wooden cabin surrounded by nothing but trees, it felt like the perfect place to unwind. The first evening was calm. I spent my time setting up, unpacking my bags, and getting the fire going in the hearth. It was late autumn, and the chill was starting to creep in. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, the warmth from the fire felt good. I had a simple meal, read a bit, then crawled into bed early, hoping to get a good night's sleep after a long drive. Around midnight, I woke up to an odd noise. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to stir me from my sleep. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch scraping against the cabin, but it wasn't quite the same sound. It was more like something soft, almost a rustling, mixed with something that sounded like a quiet shuffle. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening intently. I didn't want to be paranoid, but something about it felt off. I tried to shake it off and went back to sleep. The next day, I went out for a short hike around the area. The woods were beautiful, thick with pine trees, the ground covered in a blanket of orange and yellow leaves. It was peaceful, the kind of silence you can only get when you're far away from people. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, like something small darting between trees. But when I stopped and looked, there was nothing there. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me, maybe from being so used to the city's constant noise. Still, I couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that stuck with me. It was late afternoon when I made my way back to the cabin, and the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. That evening, I went to bed a little earlier than usual, hoping I'd sleep better. But around midnight again, I was jolted awake by the same odd sound. This time, it was closer, and it was definitely not the wind. It sounded like something was moving around outside. I got out of bed slowly, careful not to make a sound, and tiptoed over to the window. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting pale, ghostly shadows across the ground. I peered into the dark woods, but I couldn't see anything. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal out there. But then I heard it again. A soft, shuffling noise, and this time it was coming from just outside the cabin. My heart raced. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal, but whatever it was moving around too deliberately. The quiet scraping sound I heard earlier was back. I stayed frozen in my spot, unsure of what to do. I grabbed the flashlight on my nightstand and quietly walked over to the door, pressing my ear to the wood. The sound was getting closer, like something was circling the cabin, slowly. I couldn't hear footsteps, just the soft shuffle, like dragging. It was the kind of noise you hear when someone's walking in loose gravel, but it was softer, like whatever was out there was trying to move as quietly as possible. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to go outside, but I also didn't want to risk whatever it was knowing I was inside. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it an animal? Maybe a bear or a raccoon? But the more I thought about it, the less those explanations made sense. No animal I knew moved like that. I stayed there, heart pounding, waiting for what felt like hours. The sound finally stopped, and the silence felt even worse than the noise had. I waited, straining my ears to hear anything, but there was nothing. I didn't dare go outside to check, and I spent the rest of the night lying awake in bed, trying to ignore the creeping dread that had taken over. The next morning, I tried to put everything behind me. I told myself it was just my imagination or maybe a raccoon getting too close to the cabin. I spent most of the day outside, exploring the area more thoroughly, but every now and then, I thought I saw something moving between the trees. It was too far away to make out, but it felt like something was following me. By that evening, I was feeling paranoid. The strange noises from the night before still lingered in my mind, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I locked all the doors and windows before going to bed, though it didn't help ease my anxiety. Around midnight, I was jolted awake again, but this time it wasn't just a noise. This time I saw it. At first, I thought it was just the moonlight playing tricks on me, but then I saw movement outside, right near the edge of the porch. It was so strange that it took me a second to process what I was seeing. At first, I thought it was a person, but the figure was too thin, too unnatural. It was crouched down low to the ground, moving in a way that didn't look human. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over its bones. Its arms were unnaturally long, and I could see the sharp outlines of ribs and joints that seemed to bend in odd angles. It was small, but not like a child. It was skinny, almost emaciated. It had no real discernible features, just a twisted, hunched shape moving in the dark. It didn't walk or run. It crawled, dragging its limbs behind it in jerky, unnatural motions. I could see its hands reaching out toward the cabin, as if searching for something. The worst part? It didn't seem to care about the noise. It didn't care that I could see it. It didn't flinch or look up. It just kept moving, almost like it was unaware of anything. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I watched as it crept closer to the cabin, until it was just a few feet from the door. Then it stopped. For what felt like an eternity, it stayed there, unmoving. And then, without warning, it turned and started crawling back toward the woods, disappearing into the darkness. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Couldn't have been real, could it? It was too bizarre, too twisted. But the lingering feeling in my gut told me it wasn't some hallucination. It was real. Whatever that thing was, it was real. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. I sat there, staring out the window, half expecting the creature to come back, but nothing ever did. The silence outside was suffocating. Every creak of the cabin felt amplified, like the whole place was closing in on me. At dawn, I packed up my things and left. I didn't wait to see if the creature came back. I just wanted to be gone. I didn't care about the beautiful, remote cabin anymore. All I wanted was to be back in the safety of civilization. As I drove away, I glanced at the woods one last time, but there was nothing there. The trees stood still, like they always had, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew that whatever it was still out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting for the next person who dared to stay in that cabin. It was the kind of night that felt like it was never going to end. The air outside had a chill to it, though it wasn't too cold, just enough to make me pull my jacket tighter around me as I sat by the small fire pit in front of the cabin. I had rented the cabin for the weekend, wanting some time to clear my head and enjoy some solitude. There was something peaceful about being out here, far away from the noise of the city and the constant buzz of people. The sound of wind rustling through the trees and the occasional crackle of the fire was the only company I had. I had spent the whole day hiking around the area, taking in the sights. The cabin was isolated, tucked away in the woods, surrounded by towering pines. It felt like the kind of place where nothing could go wrong. A safe place, a quiet place. But as the sun sank lower behind the hills, I began to feel a sense of unease, a creeping feeling I couldn't shake. It was the kind of feeling you get when something isn't quite right, but you can't put your finger on it. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination getting the best of me. I wasn't used to being alone in a place this remote. Sure, I'd gone camping before, but it had never been like this. The isolation was different. There was no cell service, no neighbors, nothing. Just the woods and the cabin, and whatever might be lurking out there. As darkness fell, I went inside the cabin, lit a lamp, and decided to make some dinner. The place was small, rustic, but comfortable enough. The fireplace crackled and popped, and the scent of wood smoke filled the air. I felt safe again, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the fire and the warmth it gave off. But that feeling didn't last long. I heard a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. It was the sound of something moving outside. I stood still, holding my breath, straining my ears. It was like the sound of footsteps crunching on the dry leaves and twigs of the forest floor. Too deliberate, too heavy to be a deer or any of the other animals I had seen earlier. No, this was something different. Someone different. My heart began to race, and a cold sweat formed on the back of my neck. I slowly walked to the window and peered out, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. The trees were too thick, the shadows too deep. Still, the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was unbearable. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I tried to distract myself by getting back to dinner, but my hands trembled as I cooked. Every little noise outside made me jump, and my mind kept going back to the sound of those footsteps. What if someone was out there? What if they had been watching me for hours, waiting for the right moment? I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my gut. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and stepped outside, telling myself I was being ridiculous. I was just being paranoid. But I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Standing at the edge of the trees, not far from the cabin, was a man. He was tall, his face obscured by the shadows, but I could make out his silhouette. He was holding something in his hands. An axe. A sharp, gleaming axe that caught the faint light from the cabin. For a moment I froze. My mind screamed at me to run, to get back inside the cabin, to lock the door and never look back. But my legs wouldn't move. The man just stood there, staring at me. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound. He simply watched. Then he started moving. Slowly at first, almost as if he were testing the ground beneath him. But with every step, my heart pounded harder. My breath quickened. I backed up, my eyes never leaving him. He was coming closer, and with every step, I could see the gleam of the axe more clearly in the moonlight. I turned and ran. My feet hit the ground hard as I sprinted toward the cabin, my mind racing. I slammed the door shut behind me and bolted it, breathing heavily. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. I had known this before I even rented the cabin, but I had hoped it wouldn't matter. I grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the kitchen and held it in my hands, my fingers tightening around the handle. I felt ridiculous, but it was all I had. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made me jump. I kept telling myself that I was overreacting, that maybe the man was just lost or looking for help. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I heard the sound of footsteps again, this time much closer. He was circling the cabin, moving just out of sight. I could hear the rustle of leaves under his boots, the scrape of the axe against the ground. I knew he was trying to find a way in. My thoughts were racing. What was I going to do? There was no way out. The cabin was small, and the only other door led out to the back porch, which was just as vulnerable as the front. The windows were too high to climb through. I had no choice but to stay inside and wait. Wait for him to make his move. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last. The man didn't make a sound, didn't give away his position, but I could feel him out there, moving around the cabin like a predator stalking its prey. Then there was a loud crash, a splintering of wood, followed by a deep, guttural grunt. The man had broken through the back door. I grabbed the skillet, my knuckles white against the handle. My heart was in my throat. I had no idea what I was going to do, but I couldn't just sit here and wait for him to get inside. I heard him moving inside the cabin now, his footsteps heavy, deliberate. He was close, too close. The door to the kitchen swung open, and I swung the skillet at him, hitting him square in the chest. He grunted in surprise, stumbling back. For a moment, I thought I had caught him off guard, but then he recovered, his eyes locking onto mine with a cold, crazed intensity. He raised the axe. I didn't hesitate. I dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the swing. The axe hit the floor with a loud thud, sending up a spray of splinters. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and grabbed the closest thing I could find, a kitchen chair. I swung it at him, knocking him off balance for just a second. That was all the time I needed. I ran for the door, tearing through the kitchen, barely hearing the man's enraged shouts behind me. I didn't look back. I just ran. I burst through the back door and out into the night, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The cold air burned my lungs, but I didn't care. I just had to get away. I could hear him behind me, his heavy footsteps pounding against the ground, but I didn't dare look back. I ran through the woods, the trees blurring past me as I pushed myself harder, faster. Eventually, I made it to the road. A car passed by, and I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help. The car stopped, and the driver rushed over to me, asking if I was okay. I could barely speak, my voice trembling as I explained what had happened. The man with the axe was never found. The police came, searched the area, but there was no sign of him. They said he was probably just a drifter or someone who had been hiding out in the woods. They never figured out his motive, but I knew he had come there with one purpose: to harm me. I never went back to that cabin. The memories of that night stayed with me, and every time I saw an axe, I would freeze, the terror of those moments rushing back. But I was lucky. I survived, and that was all that mattered. The night felt too quiet as I sat in the small, one-room cabin nestled deep in the woods. I had rented it for the weekend, hoping to get some time away from the noise of the city. The cabin was simple, wooden, and small, but it had a certain charm to it. There was a fireplace in the corner, a table with a couple of chairs, and an old couch that had seen better days. I wasn't expecting anything more than peace and solitude, but sometimes things don't go as planned. The first day had been perfect. I'd hiked around the area, spent some time by the nearby creek, and enjoyed the silence. There wasn't a single person for miles, and the air was fresh with that earthy smell you only get in deep forests. I had everything I needed: a small bag of supplies, a few books, and my own thoughts to keep me company. But as night fell, something started to feel off. The fire crackled softly in the corner, its warmth a comfort against the chill of the evening air. Still, something was missing, something I couldn't quite place. I tried to shrug it off, thinking it was just the loneliness of being so far from anyone. I had grown used to being alone, but this time it felt different. Maybe it was the cabin, the isolation, or just the weird feeling that something was watching me. I could hear the wind outside, whispering through the trees, but beyond that, there was nothing. No animals, no insects, not even the distant hum of a passing car. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I had just finished eating a simple dinner, some canned beans and rice, when I heard it, a rustling sound from outside, faint at first, but growing louder. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, maybe a bear looking for food. I wasn't worried. I had a few cans of bear spray nearby, just in case. I walked over to the small window, my breath fogging up the glass as I peered out into the darkness. There was nothing. Still, the sound persisted. It wasn't the usual noise of animals, though. It sounded different. It was like something dragging its feet through the underbrush, heavy and slow. Not the skittering of a small creature, but the deliberate movement of something larger, something unfamiliar. My heart skipped a beat. I had read about strange things in the woods, stories about mysterious creatures and things that didn't belong. But I always thought those were just stories. I stood there for a while, staring into the dark. The moonlight barely filtered through the trees, leaving the world outside mostly black. The rustling stopped. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise as a sudden cold wave passed over me. I didn't know what it was, but it didn't feel natural. I stepped back from the window, my mind racing. Maybe it was just a person out there, someone else in the woods. But why would they be moving like that? Why so slowly? And why didn't I hear a vehicle or any other signs of life? I decided to stay inside for the rest of the night. I added some wood to the fire and sat back down on the couch, pulling a blanket over me. My mind wandered, thinking of every possible explanation for the strange noise. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe just the wind playing tricks on me. But the more I thought about it, the less likely that seemed. My instincts told me there was something out there, something I couldn't explain. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. The rustling was louder, almost right outside the cabin. I froze, my eyes wide, my breath shallow. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every thump echoing in my ears. I grabbed the bear spray, my fingers trembling as I held it in my hand. The wind picked up, and the sound faded once more. But this time, I wasn't letting it go. Something was out there, and it wasn't going to leave. I grabbed a flashlight, shining it through the small window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and the occasional rock. There was no movement, no sign of what had made that noise. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It felt like something was right there, watching, waiting. I kept the flashlight aimed at the woods around the cabin, the beam bouncing off the trees as I scanned the area. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it, a shape. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakable. a shadow in the trees, barely visible in the dim light. It was moving, but very slowly, almost crawling along the ground. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't an animal. The way it moved so low to the ground wasn't natural. It was wrong. It looked like something from a nightmare. The figure was hunched over, its limbs long and spindly. I couldn't make out much detail, but the shape of it was enough to send a wave of panic through me. I instinctively backed away from the window, my mind racing. What the hell was that thing? I had to get out of there, but where could I go? I was miles from anyone. The nearest town was an hour's drive, and I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. The cabin was my only shelter. I moved quickly, bolting the door and grabbing my phone. No signal. Of course. I tried the landline, but it was dead too. I felt a wave of helplessness wash over me. I was stuck, alone, and whatever that thing was, it was still out there. I could hear it now, moving around the cabin. The scraping of something against the wood, like claws dragging slowly across the surface. I felt like I was losing my mind. I couldn't stay in the cabin. I had to leave, but as soon as I reached for the door, the scraping stopped. I froze, not daring to move. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was only a few minutes. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go outside with whatever that thing was out there. I had no weapons, no way to defend myself. All I had was my instincts, and they were telling me to stay hidden. I slowly sat down on the couch, my back pressed against the wall, my legs trembling. I didn't know how long I sat there, but eventually, the noise outside stopped altogether. I couldn't hear anything. No scraping, no rustling, just the sound of my own breath. I thought about the flashlight, the figure in the woods. I thought about how I might have imagined it, how it could have been an animal or just the wind. But I knew it wasn't. I had seen it. Whatever it was real. I must have drifted off to sleep, because when I woke up, it was morning. The sun was just starting to peek through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I felt groggy and disoriented, but I knew I had to leave. I grabbed my bag, my coat, and headed for the door. I opened it slowly, carefully, expecting to see something or someone waiting outside. But there was nothing, just the quiet woods, the chirping of birds, and the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. I stepped outside, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't look back at the cabin, afraid of what I might see. I just kept walking as fast as I could until I reached the main road. It was then that I realized I had left my phone, my keys, everything behind. But I didn't care. I had to get out. I had to get away from that place. As I walked down the road, I saw the familiar shape of a passing car, and I flagged it down. The driver gave me a strange look, but I didn't care. I just needed to get to town. I needed to be around people, away from whatever was out there. When I finally made it back to the safety of the town, I took a deep breath and let it all sink in. What had I seen out there? What had been watching me? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that cabin. Not ever again. And as I sat in a small diner, sipping a cup of coffee, I overheard a conversation at the table next to me. A man was telling a story about a strange creature he had seen in the woods a few miles away. He described it as something with long, spindly legs, moving low to the ground. He said it had been following him for days. I didn't need to hear any more. I knew exactly what it was, and I knew I had narrowly escaped its grasp. I've always felt at home in the cabin. It's a small place, nestled deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest neighbor that the only sounds I hear are the wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. The cabin itself is a modest structure, built from thick logs that creak and groan when the temperature drops. There's a fireplace in the main room, which I've always found comforting, and a few windows that open up to the forest, giving me a perfect view of the wilderness surrounding me. It's the kind of place that makes you feel isolated, but in a way that lets you relax. I've had this cabin for a few years now. Most of the time, I come up here to get away from the noise of the world. Just me, the trees, and whatever animals happened to wander nearby. On this particular trip, I was spending the weekend alone. I hadn't planned for anything unusual, just wanted some peace and quiet to clear my head. I drove up Friday afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The drive was long but familiar, and as I pulled down the narrow dirt road that led to my cabin, I could already feel a sense of relief wash over me. I parked my truck next to the porch and grabbed my things. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of air that smells clean and earthy. After unloading everything, I locked the truck, grabbed my keys, and made my way inside. The first thing I did was light a fire. The hearth smelled a bit musty from disuse, but it wasn't long before the crackling warmth filled the room, and the smell of burning would replace the damp scent of the cabin. I made myself something to eat, sat down with a book, and just relaxed. The hours passed without incident. Outside, the forest settled into the deep quiet of night. It was the kind of stillness that felt comforting at first but slowly started to feel a little off. The wind had died down, and there were no sounds of animals. No rustling in the trees, no chirping insects, just silence. By 10:30, I was starting to feel a little uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, even though I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The wind picked up again outside, and I could hear branches scraping against the roof. That was normal, I told myself. It had been like this before. Around midnight, I started hearing a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. At first, I thought it was an animal, a bear or something larger moving through the trees. But it wasn't the usual sound of heavy paws dragging through the brush. This was more deliberate, a series of soft thuds, like someone was walking slowly across the ground. I froze, listening intently. The sound came from just outside, maybe a few yards from the cabin. I stood up from my chair, straining to hear. The thud stopped, and then I heard a sharp crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The logical part of me told me it was just an animal, probably a deer or a smaller creature. But the way it had moved so carefully, so deliberately, didn't sit right with me. I glanced over at the windows, but they were too dark to see anything clearly outside. I told myself to relax and that nothing was out of the ordinary. The animals around here were used to being near humans, right? I got up and went to the kitchen to grab a drink, trying to shake off the tension that had settled in my chest. I glanced out the window again. The forest was dark, and I could just barely make out the outlines of the trees in the moonlight. The only movement was the wind swaying the branches. But still, something about the night felt wrong. After a while, I made my way to bed. I locked the door behind me, like I always did, and pulled the covers up. The bed was comfortable, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept returning to the sounds I'd heard outside. What had it been? I tried to tell myself it was just a deer or some other animal, but the more I thought about it, the more it didn't feel like that. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke with a start. The cabin was completely still, but I could hear something soft and rhythmic, almost like breathing. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound was faint, but it was there. It wasn't coming from inside the cabin. No, it was coming from outside, just outside the wall next to my bed. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I sat there, wide awake, listening to the soft inhale and exhale of whatever it was. The breathing was slow, almost deliberate, and it felt too close, too real. I couldn't sit there any longer. Slowly, I slid out of bed, moving as quietly as I could. My bare feet made no sound on the wooden floor. I crept over to the window and slowly lifted the curtain, trying to peer outside without making a sound. My heart was in my throat now. The night was dark, but there was enough moonlight to make out the faint shape of the trees and the shadows they cast. I saw nothing, but the breathing didn't stop. I moved away from the window and glanced over at the door. It was locked, but the lock didn't make me feel safe. I had always felt safe here before, but now everything felt different. I had no idea what was out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to find out. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote, but something about the rhythmic breathing felt too intentional, too close. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand and quietly moved toward the door. As I moved, I heard the breathing again, and then, just like before, the faint snap of a branch breaking. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving. The flashlight beam cut through the dark as I slowly turned it toward the front door. I couldn't see much, but I felt like I was being watched. I held my breath as I reached for the door's handle, careful not to make any noise. My heart was racing, and my mind was running wild with all the possibilities of what might be out there. I took a deep breath, opened the door a crack, and peered out into the yard. Nothing. The yard was empty, just the way it should be. But something in my gut told me I wasn't alone. I took another step forward, the beam of the flashlight sweeping across the yard, but the light didn't catch anything. It was just trees and the empty stillness of the woods. I was about to step back inside when I saw movement in the shadows near the edge of the trees. It wasn't big, but it was enough to make me freeze. There, just barely visible in the darkness, was something crouching low to the ground, watching me. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively stepped back, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, breathing hard, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Was it a person or something else? I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting in the living room, the flashlight in my hand, watching out the windows. Every time I heard a sound, I tensed, waiting for something to move just beyond the edge of the light. But nothing happened. By morning, the air had a familiar stillness to it again, the kind that comes with the end of a storm. I didn't leave the cabin until the sun was fully up. I spent the next few hours packing up and preparing to head home. The entire time, I felt like I was being watched, but there was nothing to see, just the trees and the endless woods. As I was locking up the cabin, I turned to take one last look at the surrounding forest. The place felt different now somehow. The familiar woods that I had come to love now seemed darker, as if they were hiding something just out of view. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened that night. It seemed crazy to try and explain the feeling of being watched, the slow, deliberate breathing just outside my window. I don't know if anyone would believe me. All I knew was that when I left the cabin, I left with a sense of relief, but also a lingering feeling that whatever was out there had been waiting for me to leave. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe I wasn't alone after all. I'll never really know. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching the cabin, waiting for the next time I decided to come back. The night I decided to spend in my cabin, deep in the woods, felt different. I'd been there a handful of times before, but this time, something felt off. Maybe it was the way the air smelled, drier than usual, almost like dust had settled over everything, making the trees and ground seem still, lifeless. The usual chorus of crickets and rustling leaves was absent. It was like the woods themselves had gone quiet for the night. I arrived late, just as the sun dipped behind the distant hills. The cabin was nothing special. A modest structure built with pine logs, a small porch, and a weathered roof that had seen its fair share of rain and snow. It was far enough from any town to feel isolated, but close enough to civilization that I didn't feel completely alone. The dirt road leading up to it was overgrown with grass, and the driveway was more like a path than anything else. A couple of old wooden chairs sat on the porch, facing the woods, as if inviting someone to sit and think for a while. I took a deep breath and let the silence surround me. I grabbed my bags and started making my way inside, the door creaking slightly as I opened it. The place smelled musty, like old wood and dampness. I kicked off my boots and set my things down by the small kitchen. It wasn't much, just a few cupboards, a tiny stove, and a small table with mismatched chairs. The only real luxury was the wood stove in the corner, which I planned on using later as the night air grew colder. After unpacking, I decided to start a fire in the stove. The crackling of the wood was comforting, and soon enough, the cabin felt warmer. I stood by the stove, watching the flames dance, thinking about the world outside. It was peaceful, too peaceful almost, like the kind of quiet that could drive someone mad if they weren't careful. I spent the next few hours doing little things around the cabin, arranging the chairs on the porch, checking the windows, making sure everything was locked. Nothing out of the ordinary happened, at least not yet. The sun had completely set by the time I decided to head out for a walk. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, letting the cool air hit my face. The trees surrounding the cabin were dense, their branches twisting and reaching out like skeletal fingers. The path behind the cabin, which led toward a small creek, was overgrown but still passable. I made my way down the path, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The only sounds were my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. The woods felt oddly still, as if everything was holding its breath. As I walked, I thought I saw something move at the edge of the light, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. I kept walking, pushing through the dense underbrush. I didn't know why, but I had a feeling I needed to go deeper, just a little further into the woods. Maybe it was the solitude, or maybe the silence had become too much for me to bear. Either way, I found myself standing at the creek, its water running quietly in the dark. The rocks around it were slick with moss, and the air smelled of damp earth. I sat down on one of the larger stones, letting the coolness of the night wash over me. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling behind me, just out of sight. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something deliberate. I stood up quickly, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I scanned the area around me. The woods were still, eerily still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stood there for a few moments, trying to calm myself down. I had no reason to be scared. It was just the woods, just the isolation getting to me. But something was wrong. I decided to head back to the cabin. As I walked along the path, the sense of being watched didn't fade. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, but nothing was there. When I finally reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me and checked the windows, just to be sure. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Someone outside, maybe, but no one was there. The cabin was as quiet as it had been before. I decided to stay inside for the rest of the night, curling up with a book by the fire. The wind had picked up, causing the trees outside to groan and creak. Every now and then, the light from the fire would flicker, casting long shadows on the walls of the cabin. The noises of the night were more pronounced now, and I could hear the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional snap of a twig from somewhere in the woods. It didn't help that the cabin was so quiet inside. Each sound seemed amplified, like the whole place was echoing with memories and secrets. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. I blew out the lantern and climbed into bed, pulling the thick covers up to my chin. The room was cool, but not uncomfortably so. The bed creaked slightly as I shifted, trying to find a comfortable spot. Just as I started to doze off, I heard a faint tapping on the window. I froze. The sound was soft, almost like a branch brushing against the glass, but it didn't stop. Kept tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. I slowly turned my head to face the window, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no wind, and no tree nearby that could be causing it. I sat up slowly, staring at the window. The tapping continued, growing louder now, almost as if someone was tapping with their fingers. I slowly got out of bed and made my way toward the window, my footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. As I got closer, the tapping stopped. I stood there for a moment, my breath caught in my throat. I reached for the curtain, but my hand hesitated. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I pulled the curtain aside, my heart racing. Outside, the moonlight illuminated the front yard, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. There was nothing there. No figure, no shadow, nothing at all. I let out a sigh of relief and took a step back, my body still tense. I told myself it was just a trick of the wind or an animal brushing against the glass. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every small noise seemed amplified in the silence of the cabin. Each creak of the floor, each shift of the wind outside. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to close my eyes. Finally, I drifted off into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the cracks in the cabin's shutters. The woods were quiet again, and the air felt less oppressive. I went about my morning routine, making coffee, stretching my legs outside, and checking the cabin once more. There were no signs of anything unusual, no footprints in the dirt around the cabin, no signs of anything having been disturbed. But something inside me still felt off, like there was a presence lingering in the woods, just beyond the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been watching me, following me, even though there was no real evidence to back it up. That afternoon, I decided to head into town for a bit of a distraction. As I drove down the dirt road, I glanced back at the cabin in the rearview mirror, the small structure barely visible behind the trees. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The cabin had always been a place of comfort for me, a retreat from the chaos of the outside world, but now it felt different. I wasn't sure if it was the isolation getting to me, or if something more sinister had happened the night before. A few days later, I returned to the cabin. This time I felt more prepared. I had a stronger sense of the place and the woods around it, but the unease still lingered. As I unpacked my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, just beyond the trees. But nothing ever happened after that. No strange noises, no tapping on the windows. The woods remained silent, and the cabin, though old and creaky, stayed secure. Maybe it had all been my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe the quiet of the place had simply gotten to me. In the end, I learned something about myself. The fear I had felt, the unease in my gut, wasn't from something outside. It was from inside me. I had come to the cabin seeking peace, but what I found was a reminder that even in solitude, the mind can create its own terror. I left the cabin a few days later, not with a sense of fear, but with a greater understanding of how isolation can shape your thoughts. And the cabin, for all its creaks and whispers, was just a place. It wasn't haunted. It wasn't cursed. It was simply part of the woods, as alive and quiet as everything else in that world. I was sitting in my hunting shack, the only place I could call my own for miles. It's tucked deep in the woods, far from any towns or other people, and that's exactly why I love it. It's a small, no-frills cabin made of weathered logs, a bit crooked from years of sitting there, surrounded by tall trees and nothing but the quiet sounds of nature. When I built it, it was supposed to be a getaway, a retreat from everything. I'd spent months clearing the land, hauling materials in by hand, and finally, I had a place where I could relax, hunt, and just disappear from the world for a while. The cabin wasn't anything special, but it had everything I needed. A wood stove for warmth, a small table, a cot where I could sleep, and a small window with a view of the thick forest that stretched for miles in every direction. I loved the solitude, the stillness of it all. It was my escape. That night, I was alone in the cabin. The last few days had been spent hunting and gathering firewood. I had a small fire going in the stove, the crackling of the wood keeping the chill of the early fall night at bay. The scent of pine and damp earth drifted in through the cracks of the old wood. There was a chill in the air, but it was a good kind of cold, the kind that made you feel alive, awake, like the world was quiet and listening. I had just finished making a simple dinner, just some canned beans and jerky, and was sitting at the table, the half-empty can beside me, when I first heard it. A sound from outside. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was a deer or something else moving through the underbrush. The woods were full of life, even in the dark, and I was used to hearing animals rustling around. But then I heard it again. This time, it was a little closer. A snap. A twig breaking, sharp and clear. It wasn't the kind of sound an animal would make. Too deliberate, too controlled. My hand instinctively moved to the rifle leaning against the wall beside me. I didn't make any sudden moves, just sat there, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I listened harder, straining to hear over the crackling fire. There it was again, another snap, followed by the sound of something. Someone moving around outside. It wasn't just the usual rustling of animals. This was different. It was deliberate, like whoever or whatever was out there was trying to move quietly but wasn't quite succeeding. I sat there for a long time, not wanting to make a sound. The fire was still crackling softly, but the silence from outside was thick, pressing in. Felt like the woods were holding their breath. I waited for a few minutes, wondering if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, this time closer, much closer. I grabbed the rifle, silently slipping it into my hands. I wasn't sure what was out there, but something didn't feel right. I wasn't going to take any chances. I moved quietly to the window, peeking out through the gap in the curtains. The moonlight was barely enough to see by, but I could just make out the shadows of the trees, their long limbs stretching out like fingers into the night. There was nothing, not a thing that looked unusual, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. I could hear it now, heavy breathing, slow and deliberate. It was coming from somewhere just outside the cabin, near the side. I froze. I didn't move a muscle, barely even breathing. It wasn't the kind of breathing an animal would make. It sounded too human. I crept back to the door, checking the lock, making sure it was secure. I didn't know who or what was out there, but I wasn't about to find out the hard way. I slid the rifle up against my shoulder, keeping my back pressed against the wall, listening for any signs of movement. The minutes felt like hours. The only sound in the cabin was the crackling of the fire and the pounding of my own heart in my chest. Outside, the breathing continued, steady and deliberate. Whoever or whatever it was still out there, circling the cabin. Suddenly, the sound stopped. Just like that, it went completely silent. I stood there, tense, waiting for something to happen. I wasn't sure if I should make a move or stay hidden. The silence was unnerving, like the world was holding its breath again, waiting for something to break it. Then, without warning, I heard a loud thud against the side of the cabin, followed by a scraping sound, like something was dragging across the logs. I jumped, the rifle nearly slipping from my hands. The sound was so close, I could almost feel it vibrating in the walls. I quickly moved to the window again, pressing my face close to the glass, trying to see anything. It was too dark to see anything clearly, but there was definitely something out there. A shadow just at the edge of the tree line. I didn't hesitate. I threw open the door, rifle raised, and stepped out onto the small porch. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and biting, and I immediately regretted leaving the warmth of the cabin. But I wasn't going to let whatever was out there take me by surprise. I scanned the darkness, looking for any sign of movement. The forest was still too still. Nothing was making a sound, not even the wind. I slowly made my way around the cabin, moving cautiously, trying to stay low, keep hidden. The ground was soft under my boots, the smell of pine and wet earth filling the air. Then I heard it again, a soft, dragging sound coming from the far side of the cabin. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever it was close. I could hear it moving around, but I couldn't see anything. I started to move toward the sound, my breath coming in shallow gasps, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My mind raced, trying to figure out what I was dealing with. Was it a person? A hunter who had lost their way? Or was it something else? Something far more dangerous? I reached the corner of the cabin, the sound getting louder, closer. I peeked around the edge, trying to see past the shadows. That's when I saw it. A figure crouched low to the ground, dragging something heavy behind them. It was just barely visible, a shadow among shadows, but I could make out enough to know it wasn't an animal. It was a person moving like they were sneaking, but they didn't know I was there. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know who this person was, but I wasn't about to take any chances. I raised the rifle, aiming it toward the figure, my finger on the trigger. But before I could make a move, the figure stood up. The motion was sudden, and they turned toward the cabin, walking straight toward me. I could see their face now, illuminated by the faint light from the moon, and for a split second, everything in me froze. The man's face was gaunt, his eyes wide and wild, like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were torn, and he was covered in dirt and grime. He looked like he hadn't seen civilization in a long time. I didn't know if he was dangerous, but something about the look in his eyes told me he was. He wasn't here for a friendly chat. I backed up slowly, keeping the rifle trained on him. My fingers were trembling now, my whole body shaking from the adrenaline. But I didn't dare lower the rifle. The man stopped just a few feet from me. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me with those wide, crazed eyes. It felt like hours passed in that moment, though it was probably only a few seconds. Couldn't move, couldn't speak. The only thing I could do was keep the rifle steady, hoping I wouldn't have to use it. Finally, the man took a slow step back, his eyes never leaving mine. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the darkness, vanishing into the woods as quietly as he had come. I stood there for a long time, rifle still raised, waiting for him to come back. But he didn't. The woods were quiet again. I never saw that man again, and I never figured out what he was doing out there. But after that night, I made sure to lock the door every time I went to bed. The feeling of someone, or something, lurking just outside the cabin stayed with me for a long time. The woods were never quite as peaceful after that, but I never left. My hunting shack remained my retreat, my place to get away from the world. The man who had been out there never returned, and over time, I learned to shake the feeling of being watched. I never let my guard down again, though. The woods are a strange place, and I learned that night that you can never really be alone out there. You just never know what might be lurking in the darkness.